Hello, dear viewers. Support me by subscribing to my channel and share my video if you like it. And also, make sure you comment your thoughts. Now let's start the video. Blood everywhere. Guilt, fear, despair, grief, pain, hopelessness, death. A teenage boy's corpse lay on the ground, broken, bloody, torn, twisted, and tortured. His death had been gruesome and painful, drawn out for days before his body had finally given out. His screams still echoed in the oppressive, smoke-laden air, trapped by the billowing clouds that blotted out the sun. Smoldering fires burned in the distance, their orange light casting a ghastly glow on the carnage depicted in the scene around him. Shift. On the cracked, barren, and dusty soil near the teenager, a little child, barely 7 years old, lay draped over a sharp, craggy pile of rubble from what had once been a tall, proud building. He was barely recognizable as male, his body was so mutilated and shredded, as though some wild beast had mauled him and left his bloody remains to be pounded into the ground by a rock slide or something equally as violent. Both boys were clearly indisputably dead. Shift. A fist slugged itself into the face of the watcher, clouding his vision momentarily and throwing him to the ground. When his sight returned, he found that he was surrounded by an unknown number of people. Though he couldn't see their faces clearly, he knew that they were cold, unsympathetic, mocking, and disgusted. He struggled to get up, only to find that he couldn't move his arms or his legs because something bound them together. Someone behind him that he couldn't see picked him up by the back of his shirt, forcing him to face his attacker. The fist slammed itself into his face again. But this time, he was kept from falling by the stranger behind him. His entire body was racked with pain, beaten and broken almost as badly as the children's were. Blood dripped from a cut on his forehead into his eyes, further obscuring his vision to the point where he could barely make out the features of the person who had hit him. Another boy, but this one stood proudly despite his small stature, his flame-like black hair adding a few inches in height. The child raised his hand again, face dispassionate as a ball of ki formed in front of his outright palm, but his eyes betrayed him. Even as he prepared to deliver the final blow to the prisoner, his eyes spoke of regret and remorse for what he was about to do. In the boy's dark eyes, the prisoner could see that he did not want to do this, and yet, for some reason, had to. The boy's lips moved, but strangely, the watcher couldn't hear what was said. Everything flashed a brilliant, blinding white as the searing ball of ki left its owner's hand and descended on its target. With a jolt, Bardock woke up, cold sweat pouring down his face as the nightmare continued to replay in his head. He shivered violently and shook his head in a vain attempt to clear it of the images of Goku and Raditz as they lay in their separate pools of blood. Unconsciously grasping his sleeping son protectively, he trembled under the onslaught of emotions that the dream had evoked. It was only a dream, he told himself over and over, squeezing his eyes closed as he buried his face in his son's hair. I've just been so worried about Goku dying that it got translated into an exaggerated nightmare. That's all. Shivering again, he couldn't help but lift his head up so he could look at his peacefully sleeping son, examining him to make sure that he was truly alive and unharmed beyond the injuries he'd already received. True to his assumption, the chibi Saiyan was quite well, sleeping with a contented look on his face. At some point during the time that Bardock had been dozing off, the older Saiyan's tail had found its way into the boy's grasp, and now Goku had the tip in his mouth and was sucking on it in his sleep, a gesture that made him seem years younger, a baby in his father's lap. Giving a happy sigh, the little boy snuggled closer to his father's warm chest. A shuddering wave of relief washed over him, and he blinked back the tears that threatened to form in his eyes. It was only a dream, he firmly repeated a final time, irritated with himself for reacting so badly to some bit of nonsense cooked up by his overstressed brain. Shoving the whole matter to the back of his mind, he concentrated on the tiny form cradled in his arms, unable to help the small smile that crept its way onto his lips at the sight of his son drooling all over his tail. He'd never held either of his sons like this when they were little, had never allowed them to get their hands on his tail, let alone place it in their mouths. He could recall feeling that it was humiliating to subject himself to their childish behavior, that it was soft and weak to show anything that might be interpreted as fondness for either of his offspring. Somewhere along the course of time, those opinions had changed, and he no longer felt the same way. Now he was content to let Goku continue to suck on his tail, happy to simply hold him in his arms, not caring anymore what kind of image he was projecting. A faint sense of sadness touched his heart as he thought on all the years of tail slobbering he had missed out on because he had never allowed himself to get close to his children. He almost wished that he could turn back time and do things differently, but then he and his sons would not be who they were today. For better or for worse, this was how things had turned out, and he was glad that he at least had his son now. Closing his eyes again, he inhaled deeply, then exhaled, simply enjoying the feel of holding his smallest son against his chest. The smile continued to play across his face, all concerns with the terrible dream forgotten as a deep sense of peace enveloped him. Giving his son a gentle squeeze, he opened his eyes, and found that he was no longer in the room he had been in when he closed his eyes. Black. That was the predominant color in the half of the store where he and Bulma were now standing. Considering the mood Raditz was in, black was the perfect color. He could almost imagine that there was a little storm cloud floating over his head. He was that angry. Angry with the little Anna for putting him through this humiliation, and angry with himself for letting her, and yet, there didn't seem to be a damn thing he could do about it. He felt like a puppet with the blue-haired girl holding the strings, helpless and forced to do whatever she wanted. He still didn't know how she had done it. "How much longer is this supposed to take?" he growled impatiently, as the store clerk fitted another piece of the ridiculous suit, checking to make sure that coat hung correctly from his broad shoulders. The clerk, having long since gotten used to the boy's complaints, ignored him and continued with his work. Discovering an adjustment that needed to be made, he removed the coat and took it over to his workbench where he could alter it appropriately. "Don't be such a baby, Raditz," Bulma murmured, staring happily at the shirtless Saiyan standing on a stool in the middle of the formal wear shop. "It's only been half an hour, and you do want it to fit right, don't you?" "I never wanted to wear the damn thing in the first place," Raditz grated out through clenched teeth. "You're the one who insisted on making me come to this damn store and making me stand here while this Bakayaro takes his damn time dressing me up in the most useless, uncomfortable, and constricting clothing in the known universe." He was in a bad mood and he didn't care if everyone knew it or not. Hell, maybe the brat would get the idea that he was on the edge of blowing up the entire shopping complex and just let him go home. Glaring furiously at her crush, Bulma reached out and whacked him on the back of his head. Hard. Well, hard for her. Anyway, Raditz didn't even flinch. "Watch your language, Raditz," she snapped, her eyes flashing dangerously. "And tuxedos aren't useless. If you ever want to attend a formal dance, you'll have to wear one, or they won't let you in." Her voice was rising in pitch with each word until Raditz's ears began to start ringing. Wincing in pain, he attempted to raise his hands to cover his sensitive ears, only to find that he couldn't move one of them. The damn tailor was back, and was now fitting a sleeve onto the body of the coat, pinning his arm to his side in the process. And furthermore, Bulma screeched, standing on tiptoe to bring her face closer to Raditz's. "If you keep yelling and embarrass me in front of all these people, I'm going to make your life a miserable living hell." For some reason she didn't seem to realize, or maybe she just didn't care, that she was screaming so loudly that the clothes on the racks were shaking violently, threatening to fall off their hangers. Raditz quailed under the intense fury that Bulma radiated from every square inch of her 11-year-old body. Seeing this, Bulma nodded sharply and sat down in a chair to wait for the tailor to finish putting together the beautiful black and white tuxedo. The teenager sighed moodily and settled for glaring down at his bare feet. Unfortunately, that only served to remind him that they had yet to pick out shoes for this new outfit, groaning miserably. The poor Saiyan boy could only close his eyes and hope that the torture would end soon, or that Kami would deign to arrange for a terrorist attack that would level the entire mall. Anything to escape this nightmare. Still holding Goku in his arms, Bardock blinked owlishly at the open, empty landscape that stretched out for as far as the eye could see. Well, not quite empty. He was standing in the middle of a flat stone stage surrounded by brick walls, and there was a building of some kind on one side. A lonely wind blew through the place, and suddenly, the area around the arena was filled with people. Humans, he absently noted somewhere in the back of his mind. His attention was attracted by a furious battle being fought in the middle of the ring, not too far from where he was standing. One of the fighters was a bald man with 3 eyes, tall and well-muscled from years of fighting. But it was the other that Bardock stared at. It was Goku. As the two battled furiously, apparently oblivious to the father and son standing in the ring, Bardock's mind struggled to make sense of what he was seeing. Glancing down at the child in his arms, then back at the boy who was dueling with the bigger man, he realized that it wasn't Goku, at least not the same Goku he was holding. This other Goku was older, perhaps 14 or 15 years old, judging by how much he'd grown and how little baby fat he had. It was then that he realized that this had to be another one of his visions, and for once, it wasn't one predicting death and disaster. Having solved the mystery of what was going on, Bardock calmly walked out of the ring so he could get a better look at what was going on. Running his eyes over the crowd of spectators, he saw an older version of Bulma, a floating gray cat, and a short pig, along with the boy, Yamcha, that he had met briefly at the Kame house. The young fighter was wielding a pair of crutches, keeping the weight off his obviously broken leg. He also noted a man that looked like Muten Roshi with hair and the short, bald child, Krillin, observing from the waiting area behind the ring. Try as he might, though, Bardock was unable to find himself or Raditz anywhere. That's odd. My son seems to be in some kind of fighting tournament, but I'm not watching. I wouldn't miss this unless I didn't have a choice in the matter. What could have happened to me that would keep me from watching my son fight? Still puzzling the matter over in his mind, he continued to follow the fight as the three-eyed man took to the air, shouting something down at his younger opponent. Goku stared up at his foe fearlessly and held his ground, despite whatever the man was yelling. For some reason, Bardock was unable to make out the words, though the dream Goku seemed to hear them just fine. The human appeared to be powering up some kind of ki attack, and Bardock held his breath anxiously as the entire world flashed a brilliant, blinding white. And he was back in the room where the vision had begun, still sitting in the chair with his 7-year-old son sleeping in his arms. A feeling of melancholy swept over him as he thought back on what he had just witnessed. Why is it that for all of my visions, I'm only present for the terrible things? Why can't I ever be there for the good things? Getting up out of the chair, he paced up and down the length of the room, still carrying Goku, his mind preoccupied with the vision. Idly, he wondered how the match had ended. He hadn't been able to see how his son had reacted to that last attack the human had thrown at him. The light had been too bright to see anything clearly. Frowning, Bardock stopped pacing and looked out the window, not really seeing the world outside. That light, it was exactly like the light that ended that nightmare. Thinking about the nightmare caused him to shiver and turn away from the window. The dream had been so real down to the pain of Vegeta's fist connecting with his face. He'd never had a dream that realistic before. It was only a dream, he inwardly repeated the phrase like a mantra. It was only a dream. Sitting down on the edge of the bed, he stared off into space, his mind's eye flashing through the horrible scenes of his son's dead bodies and of the beating he'd received at the hands of his prince. It had been real, too real. In fact, it had been as real as the vision of the tournament that he had just had, beyond the fact that he hadn't been able to hear what Vegeta had been saying. But then the same thing had happened in the vision of Goku's tournament. Unbeknownst to Bardock, tears began to form in his eyes, making silver trails down the sides of his face. No, he whispered to himself. It can't be a vision. It just can't. His mind numbly grasped at any possible reason that the nightmare couldn't be a vision, but came up blank. The dream bore all the earmarks of his other visions, and there were too many parallels between it and the vision that had followed afterwards to be ignored. And yet, it made no sense. How can they both be visions when they contradict each other? He muttered, his eyebrows drawing together in a look of intense confusion and frustration. In the first one, Goku dies as a 7-year-old, whereas the second one shows him alive and well and several years older. They can't both happen. He thought briefly on the possibility that perhaps Goku hadn't been dead in the first vision, just mortally wounded. It would explain why he and Raditz hadn't been at the tournament if they'd both died while Goku recovered and went on to compete in that tournament. It was a logical enough explanation. Then he remembered the state of 7-year-old's body during the nightmare. Tail ripped off and lying limply in the dirt next to him, gaping holes in his stomach and chest, and a slit throat, along with many other injuries that would prove fatal if left untended. And Bardock came to the firm, undeniable, and heart-wrenching conclusion that his son could not have survived the torture that had been inflicted on his young body in the vision. Squeezing his eyes shut, tears still leaking out of them, he desperately clutched Goku as tightly as he dared without waking or hurting the boy, his mind reeling under the shock and confusion the two visions caused. That was how he remained for the next hour, hunched protectively over the sleeping child that he held in his arms, even as he silently cried while seated on the edge of the blood-stained bed. The excitement of obtaining both a pouch full of senzu beans and another Dragon Ball had not worn off by the time Goten and Trunks arrived back at the capsule house. In fact, they raced around outside for a full minute, chasing each other in a swift game of tag before they felt calm enough to storm the house without breaking too many things. Giggling insanely, they were too distracted to bother using their Kiga senses to see who was in the house, and so they raced blindly into the room where Bardock was sitting with Goku. Seeing the older seeing sitting on the bed with the little 7-year-old in his arms brought the two boys up short. With guilty consciences, they suddenly remembered that they were supposed to have been watching over the little chibi, but had instead left him in Vegeta's care. The thought of Vegeta actually watching over Goku was unlikely, to say the least. Goten and Trunks gulped simultaneously and nervously approached Bardock, knowing that he couldn't be very pleased with their irresponsibility. It was too late now, though, so they might as well hear what their punishment was. Surprisingly, Bardock didn't so much as blink. When the two Demi-Saiyans came into his field of vision, he continued to sit on the edge of the bed, holding a naked Goku in his arms, his eyes wide and unseeing. His entire body was twitching or shivering. Goten couldn't decide which, and he seemed completely unaware of the fact that his tail was now in the mouth of the boy in his arms. "Grandpa?" Goten asked, suddenly concerned. When Bardock didn't respond, he glanced over at Trunks, then floated up to eye level with his grandfather. This close to the Saiyan's face, he could see that the pupils in his eyes had disappeared, leaving a blank, white space where they had once been. "Grandpa?" The 8-year-old's voice was tinged with panic now, and he waved a hand frantically in front of Bardock's face. "Grandpa? Wake up!" No reaction. Goten tapped his grandfather on the shoulder, then tugged his green shirt in a vain hope that maybe physical contact would snap him out of whatever was happening to him. "Grandpa?" Trunks lifted himself off the ground so that he could get a closer look at Bardock's face. One look at Goku had told him that he was still alive and relatively well, so it couldn't be that Bardock was in a grief-stricken stupor. Hoping that perhaps a second voice talking to him would elicit a reaction from the warrior, Trunks added a verbal plea of his own. "Bardock-san, are you all right?" Unfortunately, it didn't seem that Bardock could hear either of them, since he didn't show any signs of a reaction to either of their voices. "Trunks, what's wrong with my grandpa? Why won't he wake up?" The little chibi was nearly in tears, and he reached out to grasp his grandfather's shoulder, shaking him as roughly as he dared without knocking him over. Still, there was no response. "I don't know, Goten. I've never seen him like this. I've never seen anyone like this." Gnawing on his lip with worry, the lavender-haired boy anxiously ran through his mind all the things that might possibly be wrong with Bardock, but came up blank on any one thing that matched the symptoms. "Hey Goten, try giving him a senzu bean. They're supposed to be able to heal almost anything after all, so maybe it'll cure whatever's wrong with him." The younger chibi brightened visibly and dug a hand into his gi, in search of the pouch containing the precious senzu beans. "Great idea, Trunks." Upon finding the bag, he quickly dumped a bean out into his open palm, tossing the bag and the rest of the beans to the bed. Still floating in the air, he used his other hand to pry Bardock's mouth open and was about to place the bean in the man's mouth. With a gasp, Bardock shuddered and his eyes returned to normal, his whole body trembling like a leaf in a storm. "No!" he cried out, almost as if he were in great pain or mental turmoil. Goten jumped in surprise, the small bean in his hand slipping through his fingers to bounce on the floor. Gulping down a sudden lump of fear that formed in his throat, he found that his grandfather was staring at him with haunted black eyes. Breathing heavily, the older Saiyan choked out, "It can't happen like that, Goku. I won't let it happen that way." "Grandpa?" Goten asked uncertainly. "Grandpa, I'm Goten. You're holding Goku in your lap." Bardock blinked and stared at his grandson for a moment, then glanced down at the boy in his arms. As the last vestiges of the vision left him, he shivered and shook his head in denial of what he had seen. "Grandpa, are you all right? What happened?" Tears sparkled in the little boy's eyes, which he hastily wiped away, only to be replaced by more tears. The Saiyan's gaze shifted from his grandson's face to the concerned face of the other little Demi-Saiyan in the room. Both boys stared back at him expectantly, waiting for him to give them an explanation that would allay their fears. Looking down at his son, he inwardly cringed. How could he tell them that he could see the future, and that he had just seen the destruction of their world and the deaths of everyone on the planet? How could he tell them about the horrible torture and ultimate deaths of his two sons that he had just witnessed? About his own painful death at the hands of the child who was sleeping a few rooms away. "I can sometimes see the future," he finally said, reluctance dragging at his voice. "And when I'm having a vision, I can't hear or see anything that's going on around me." He half expected them to laugh derisively and claim he was making it up, but that wasn't the reaction he got. The eyes of the two chibis widened in awe at his words, and Trunks grinned broadly. "Cool! What did you see, Bardock-san?" They both leaned forward slightly, eager to hear all about this newly discovered ability. Somewhat surprised that they actually believed him, Bardock shifted his shoulders uncomfortably. "I don't really want to talk about it, Trunks. I'm, not certain about what exactly I saw," he lied, warily eyeing the boys to see if they believed him. Fortunately for him, it appeared that they did, though their faces were twin masks of disappointment. With his eyes on the floor, it only took Goten a moment to spot the senzu bean he had dropped. Giving a delighted laugh, he darted down and picked the thing up, turning to give his grandpa a triumphant look. "Grandpa! Me and Trunks got senzu beans. Now Goku won't die." Grabbing hold of one of Bardock's hands, he thrust the bean into it, beaming the entire time. Bardock blinked owlishly, caught off guard by the reference to Goku dying so soon after his visions concerning that very same thing. The vision he had at first thought a nightmare had come back again, more extensive and graphic than before, allowing him to see every detail of every event leading up to the deaths of his sons and himself, among other things. A shudder swept over his body, and he quickly jerked his mind back to the situation at hand, using the dawning joy of being able to heal his son to wipe away those dark thoughts. His face breaking open in a wide grin, he gently removed his slobbery tail from his son's mouth, and he rubbed the boy's cheek in an effort to waken him a little. "Come on, Goku, wake up! We have something for you." Murmuring discontentedly at having the tail pulled from his mouth, Goku yawned and pressed his face into Bardock's chest in an effort to sink further into the realm of sleep. Bardock smiled and rubbed his cheek again, a little more vigorously, until Goku sleepily opened his eyes. "Oh hey, to Essen," he mumbled, tiredly, reaching one hand up to rub his bleary eyes. Knowing that it was sometime in the afternoon, Goku's greeting amused the older Saiyan. It was to be expected, of course, since the boy had only just woken up and couldn't have known what time it was, but he still found it funny for some reason. "Good morning to you too, sleepyhead," Bardock chuckled. "Here, eat this. It'll make you feel better." So saying, he popped the senzu bean into his son's mouth. With all the trust a son has in his father, Goku unquestioningly bit into the hard brown bean, chewed and swallowed. His eyes suddenly widened, and a gasp of surprise escaped his lips even as the small cuts and bruises that weren't hidden by bandages instantly vanished. The boy stared in amazement at his arms, then at the rest of his body, hesitantly reaching a hand down to gingerly touch the bandages covering the area where the hole had been in his side. Nothing. No pain at all. "Daddy, it doesn't hurt anymore," the chibi laughed in delight, pressing against his once injured side a little more firmly. Then he got a very startled look on his face, and his eyes widened to their fullest in stunned awe and wonder. "And I'm not hungry either." Grinning from ear to ear from the simple pleasure of seeing his son well again, Bardock lifted the child off his lap and set him down on the bed. "Here, let's get these bandages off you and we can get you cleaned up," he said, pulling off the wrappings from the little Saiyan's lower torso to reveal pink, unbroken skin with a few smears of blood on it. He then undid the bindings on the splint that bound Goku's formerly broken right leg and deftly removed the strips of cloth along with the splint. Again, there was no trace of any kind of injury besides the blood that had once seeped from the open wound. Goku lifted his leg up and wiggled his toes, experimentally grinning broadly at Trunks, Goten, and Bardock when there wasn't even a twinge of pain. Hopping off the bed and landing lightly on his feet, he jumped up and down a bit to test his newly healed body while the other three Saiyajin in the room watched in happy amusement. The naked little boy ran around the room in a state of giddy hyperactivity, whooping loudly for all the world to hear. Chuckling as he watched his son's antics, Bardock finally stood up and snagged his son out of mid-stride, holding him out at arm's length. "All right, it's time to get you cleaned up and dressed in some clean clothes," he said, smirking faintly as he looked into Goku's eyes. The boy had a look of mild disgust on his face, and his tail was curling and uncurling as it fought to express his glee at being healed again and his dismay at the thought of taking another bath. "Do I have to take a bath?" he pleaded. At Bardock's nod, he sagged a little bit and his tail hung limply. The warrior tucked the little scion in the crook of his arm and carried him off towards the bathroom, with Goten and Trunks tagging along close behind. Feeling sympathetic with his chibi father's predicament, Goten suddenly piped up. "Hey, I'll take a bath with you two." Taking baths is lots more fun with more people. Seeing the other boy's face light up, hopefully, the 8-year-old grinned and started pulling off his clothes while Bardock began to fill up the tub. "Me too. I'll take a bath too, Goku." Trunks chipped in, not one to be left out, and he too removed his clothing and hopped into the slowly filling tub. As the two black-haired boys clambered in as well, all three grinned up at Bardock, who was suddenly looking not quite as pleased about the prospect of bath time with 3 chibis. "Will you take a bath with us too, Bardock said?" The lilac-haired boy asked innocently, his eyes twinkling with mischief. "Please," Goten and Goku chimed in unison, giving him the patented San puppy eyes. "There's plenty of room," Goten added, followed quickly by Goku chirping, "and it'd be more fun. And you're dirty too." Trunks pointed at the various drops of blood that Bardock had gotten on himself and his clothing while holding Goku. Unable to deny their logic and their pleas, the warrior finally laughed in defeat and started pulling off his gi. "All right, you win. I'll take a bath with you too." Tugging off the weighted shirt, wristbands, and boots, he cautiously stepped into the tub and was immediately tackled by 3 wet boys. "Yai!" As he struggled under their combined weight, he awkwardly turned the faucets off and sat down. Trunks and Goten hanging off either arm and Goku sitting in his lap, his short, chubby arms wrapped as far around Bardock's torso as they would go. With twin gleams of mischief in their eyes, the 2 demi-Saiyans simultaneously shoved the older man's head under the water, with all the power that the 2 untransformed chibis could muster. Goku grinned and added in his part of the fun by tickling his father's ribs, furiously even as his 2 friends held him under the water. Bardock's body jerked and convulsed as he tried not to laugh underwater and was just about to give in, despite himself, when Goten and Trunks let his head come up, gasping for breath. Giving the trio a playful glare, he snatched all 3 up in a giant bear hug, grinning fiercely as he dunked them underwater. He held them there until they began to wriggle, then brought them up for air, laughing genuinely for the first time in what felt like eternity. With a last squeeze, he released them into the water and splashed them with his tail as he leaned back against the wall of the tub. Still giggling, Goten and Trunks each grabbed a bar of soap and set about lathering themselves up, while Goku waded over to his father and threw his arms around his neck. "Thank you, Daddy," he whispered, a smile on his lips and a hint of tears in his eyes. He didn't need to say what he was thanking Bardock for. They both knew. Bardock patted his son on the back, a gentle smile softening his features, and held him like that for a moment before reaching for a bar of soap. "Come on, let's get you cleaned up." Finally, they were finally done fitting Raditz for that tuxedo. He had thought that the torture would never end, and it had certainly seemed like time had suddenly decided it had a personal grudge against him, but the tailor had eventually finished putting the various pieces of the ridiculous suit together. After what seemed an eternity, a very relieved Raditz and a self-satisfied Bulma walked out of the store and back into the main halls of the complex. Bulma carrying the capsule that contained Raditz's new clothing and the shoes they'd picked out for him. As the Saiyan's stomach so kindly reminded him, it was well after noon, and he hadn't eaten anything since breakfast that morning. A pleasant memory that had been all but forgotten in the back of the teenager's mind. Passing by an area of the mall where food was sold, his keen Saiyajin sense of smell picked up the aromas of hundreds of different kinds of earth foods, and they all smelled wonderful. Unfortunately, it looked like Bulma was bent on visiting yet another store, since she didn't even pause as they passed by the food court. Bulma, can we get something to eat now? Alright, so, he was pleading. He honestly didn't care at this point. His pride had already suffered far worse blows today than mere begging could inflict, and damn it, he was hungry. Taking a leaf from his nephew's book, he decided to attempt one of the sun puppy eyes, TM, that seemed to work so well for Goten. Raditz widened his eyes a little and tried to look as pathetic as possible, quickening his pace so he could stare directly in Bulma's face. He inwardly cringed at what he was about to do next, but hunger easily triumphed over the last vestiges of his dignity, and he added, "Please." Bulma frowned as she thought it over. She hadn't had anything to eat yet, either, and since Saiyans needed food more than humans did, she could only guess how he must be feeling right now. However, she also knew how much they could eat, and she didn't want to spend the next hour or so watching Raditz wolf down one larger helping of food after another. "How about this?" she said, stopping so she could meet the other boy's eyes. She nearly cracked up when she saw the expression he was trying to pull, thinking privately to herself that he either just wasn't cut out for San family expressions, or he needed to work on his puppy dog eyes. What he'd ended up with was a kind of sickened grimace with a pleading tone to it. "We'll go to one more store, and then we'll get as much food as you want." The bill would be enormous, nothing she couldn't handle, but it was the best way to bribe her crush into putting up with the delay that visiting one more store would create. Torn between the desire to eat now and the thought of eating as much food as he wanted, Raditz hesitated for a moment. Finally, his shoulders slumped wearily, and he conceded, "Fine, we'll go to one more store, so long as we get to eat immediately afterwards." Grinning from the thrill of victory, Bulma grabbed hold of Raditz's hand and dragged him off down the crowded hall. "Great. Now there's this really good sports shop I want to take you. It's called Biker Glory, and they have the best sports clothing, accessories, and equipment. They specialize mainly in biking, but they dabble in a few other sports as well. Come on, it's not too far." Not really knowing why they were going to a sports store, Raditz simply shrugged and allowed himself to be led towards the store in question. He didn't participate in any of these earth sports, the only plausible reason perusing a sports shop that he could see, so he couldn't imagine what Bulma wanted to go there for, though he thought he heard her mutter something about spandex biker shorts to herself. Shaking his head ruefully, he watched as the crazy little Anna darted away into the crowded rack of sports clothes. With any lucky, she'd get lost in there and never come back. Raditz made his way carefully through the store display racks of bicycles, gazing at the strange contraptions curiously. He really had no idea why anyone would want to use such an odd mode of transportation in the first place, but he decided that it was probably more geared towards recreation rather than travel. Sitting behind the desk, Twi's saleswoman extraordinaire spied a likely Victa customer. "There's a sucker born every minute," she murmured, sauntering sweetly over to the young man who was examining a pricey 10-speed. Raditz blinked fearfully as a predatory grin came over the saleswoman's face. Why were all these Earth women so intent on chasing him around? "Why don't you hop on and give it a try?" Twi asked the twitching teen. Confusion swept over the Saiyan for a moment, then relief as he saw that the girl was referring to the bicycle. With a little shrug, Raditz hopped onto the seat. After all, how hard could it be? 17 knocked over bicycles, a dozen toppled displays, 2 nearly injured customers, and 1 irate salesperson later. Bulma finished helping Raditz pull his hair out of the bicycle spokes and hastily yanked the spooked Saiyan out of the store, weaving through the small crowd of curious onlookers that had gathered ever since Raditz had first begun accidentally wreaking of havoc. "And don't come back!" Bulma winced. Perhaps shopping with Saiyans was more hazardous to her shopping habits than she'd previously supposed. Sighing, she couldn't even find it in her heart to be angry with Raditz, especially as miserable as he was looking right now. It really hadn't been his fault, from what she could tell. It had just been an accident. Or rather, a lot of accidents. She had to stifle a chuckle as she recalled how he had ridden that bicycle right into the mountain bike sections and had the whole rack fall on top of him, trapping him and entangling his hair. If it had happened to anyone else, it would be cause for serious concern, but since it was Raditz, meaning he wouldn't be injured, it was utterly hilarious. Except for the fact that it had gotten her banned from a store. She was going to have to talk to Raditz about that later. Right now, a rather loud growl from the teenager's stomach pointedly reminded both of them about the promise Bulma had made to Raditz before the whole biker story fiasco. "Can we eat now?" Raditz whimpered. "All right, fine, we'll go eat now," Bulma said, smiling faintly as she reflected that Raditz was getting better with his puppy dog eyes. When he did that, it really made her want to just give him a hug. He was that cute. Fortunately for him, she held back on her impulse and led him off to the food court. While the 3 boys toweled themselves to a state of semi-dryness, Bardock was examining their clothing, or lack thereof in Goku's case, and determined that they all needed to be washed. Fortunately for them, Bardock did have that capsule containing some of the children's clothing Bulma had picked out, so they at least had something to change into. Unfortunately for himself, the capsule had nothing but chibi clothes, except for one outfit his size that had somehow gotten mixed in with the pile of chibi clothing that Bulma had capsulized. Recalling that rainbow tie-dye shirt, he winced. Maybe it would be better to just wear the green gay, even if it was a little bloody. Picking up the gyu to put it back on, he despairingly noticed just how much blood had gotten on it while he had been holding Goku. As clean as he was feeling after that bath, and considering it was Goku's blood, he suddenly realized he did not want to wear that gyu. With a regretful sigh, he dropped the gyu back to the floor in the pile of clothing. It looked like it would be tie-dye and blue jeans for him after all. On a second thought, he gathered up the 3 gyus, blue, orange, and green, as well as his weighted clothing, preparing to take them to the laundry room to be washed with the bandages when Bulma returned. Tossing the capsule with their clothing to Trunks, he said, "There are some new clothes in there for you 3, but there's probably too many things in that capsule for you to safely open it in here. Take it to the den and open it there, so you boys can get dressed. I'm going to take these things to the laundry room." When the 3 Jubies murmured their various forms of acquiescence, Bardock padded out of the bathroom and walked towards the laundry room. Yawning sleepily, Vegeta raised one hand to rub a little sleepy dust out of his eyes, then wriggled back into the warm blankets that surrounded him. Wait a minute, blankets? I thought I was in that chair by Kakarot's bed. How did I end up in a bed? As awareness stole over his sleep-fuzzed mind, he sat up in the bed and looked around, ascertaining that he was still in the capsule house, but in a different room from the one he last recalled being in. That's odd. I don't remember falling asleep, much less going to another room to do so. Feeling slightly disoriented, the young prince crawled out of the bed and, yawning again, stumbled towards the door. He was feeling a little hungry. Well, more than a little, and Saiyans always thought better on a full stomach. He would get something to eat, and then he tried to figure out how he had managed to move from one room to another without realizing it. As distracted as he was, and since he hadn't completely woken up yet, he didn't even notice the 3 damp and naked boys racing down the hallway until after they crashed into him. Vegeta cursed rather harshly as he suddenly found himself at the bottom of a pile of chibis, now fully awake and rather ticked off. With a few more choice phrases from his arsenal of foul language, he roughly extricated himself from the tangle of arms and legs that consisted of the other boys. Standing up and brushing himself off, the 10-year-old glowered down at the offending boys, who were also picking themselves up off the floor and hastily apologizing. "Kisama, why don't you watch where you're going?" He would have added some ear-singeing curses, but then he caught sight of Goku and Goten. Unfortunately, since neither one was wearing any clothing at the moment, it was impossible to tell them apart. Glaring from one to the other, he finally turned to Trunks and asked, "When did that Baka Kakarot get better?" Trunks gave a fair imitation of the famous Sun Grin TM and rubbed the back of his neck, somewhat embarrassed about running into his chibi father like that. "Me and Goten went to Karin's tower to get some Sanzu beans. We got back a little while ago, and Bardock gave one of them to Goku." Putting on his best scowl, the young prince folded his arms across his chest, his tail lashing back and forth in annoyance. "And just where were you 3 off to in such a hurry?" he growled, still angry about being run over. "Grandpa got new clothes, and since our old ones are dirty and we just took a bath, we get to wear the new ones." Goten chattered excitedly, dancing from one foot to the other in anticipation. "Want to come with us and see what Bulma and Grandpa bought?" Not waiting for Vegeta's answer, the black-haired chibi dashed eagerly down the hall towards the den, pulling Goku behind him. Trunks glanced at his father briefly, then took off after them, not wanting to be left out of the fun. Vegeta grumbled to himself while staring balefully down the hall where the 3 boys had disappeared, but eventually gave in to his curiosity. He really didn't have anything better to do, and he was slightly interested in seeing the new acquisitions, so he started after the 3 Saiyan children until he came to the den. They'd already opened the capsule containing the new clothing and were happily rummaging through the plethora of brightly colored chibi clothing that had quickly been scattered all over the room. Most of the various shirts were so bright, in fact, that it nearly hurt just to look at them. Sprinkled amidst the tie-dyed shirts, rainbow-colored prints, and assorted pants and shorts were a few normally colored G's, shirts, and pants, which the 3 boys neglected in favor of admiring the more eye-wrenching clothes. A feeling of uncertainty suddenly fluttered in the pit of Vegeta's stomach. All his life, he had remained aloof from those around him. He was the Saiyajin no Uji, so he was naturally better than everyone else. It wouldn't do to associate with the common rabble, or even most of the palace staff. His father and Frieza had been the only ones to hold any sort of power over him, but they never interacted with him beyond what was necessary. In Frieza's case, that was no big loss. But he sometimes secretly wished that his father had shown just a little more emotion towards his son, why King Vegeta had remained apart from his son. be it from preoccupation with ruling the Saiyan race or simply the normal barrier between adults and children. Prince Vegeta didn't know, but it had meant that he had no equals. He had essentially been alone all his short life. Until now, in the same room as him were three boys who treated him as their equal, not their better, not their lesser, but equal. Trunks and Goten, being Super Saiyajin, were far more powerful than Vegeta. It still irritated the young prince somewhat to accept the fact that the grandson of a third-class soldier could ever surpass him, but he had adjusted to it now. Trunks being stronger than Vegeta no longer bothered him, since the boy was, after all, his future son. Both boys treated him as an equal because they either didn't care about strength, or because they knew what Vegeta would one day be capable of. Then there was the third child, Goku. Goku was pathetically weak compared to even his brother, Raditz, but had the potential to become much stronger than he was now. And yet he didn't seem to realize that there was any difference between him and Vegeta. He treated everyone as an equal simply because he didn't care about strength in terms of how he interacted with others. It was an odd concept for Vegeta to understand, and yet that was the way Goku was. As he continued to watch them, a part of him wanted to go join the three in their fun, to sort through the shirts and pants in search of something that would suit his tastes, make jokes about some of the wilder articles of clothing, and participate in their casual roughhousing. Something inside him longed to play with other children, to be able to laugh and have fun and not care about who was stronger. He had never had the opportunity to do so before, but he did now. He was in the presence of three boys who would accept him as their equal, if he would only allow himself to think of them in the same way. All he had to do was swallow his pride. Vegeta had never faced a more difficult challenge in his whole life. Still staring longingly at the three children thoroughly enjoying themselves, the little Saiyan prince waged a silent war within himself. Pride, dignity, and every one of the 10 years of his royal upbringing dictated that he should just turn around and leave, but there was a terrible, lonely ache in his heart that tugged at him, pulling him towards the other children. A small lump formed in his throat, and he made his decision. It was all Bulma could do to keep herself from gaping in amazement as Raditz chomped down on his dozenth hot dog. She'd seen it before, but each time was a new opportunity for confoundment. Seeing a Saiyan eat was like watching a sunset, except considerably messier. Each experience was unique, involving a palette of colors that was unrivaled in all of nature. Raditz's palette now consisted of ketchupy red and a bright mustard yellow, with just a splash of green and white from the relish and onions. Spread out over three of the small food court tables were Raditz's previous works. The delightfully orangey yellow of sweet and sour chicken, the cheerful remnants of devoured nachos, the crumpled and forlorn waxy papers that had once wrapped scrumptious hamburgers and tacos. Fortunately for the mall cleanup crew, the teenager was a neat eater. Only bits of gooey mayonnaise and relish that had somehow found their way into his black mane stood as evidence of the mighty feasting that had just occurred. Where does it all go? Bulma wondered for the 1,000th time. Shaking herself out of her daze, the blue-haired girl looked at her watch, her eyes widening in shock. They had spent the entire day here. The mall was about to close. With a look of relief, the food court employees began hastily shutting down their respective restaurants. Not that there was much to clean up. Raditz had eaten most, if not all, of their stock, with the exception of the relieved staff at the ice cream parlor. For some reason, Raditz just didn't seem to have an appetite for ice cream. Slowly, Bulma pulled herself to her feet and latched onto Raditz's arm, dragging him towards the exit. The Saiyan protested a bit, claiming he was still hungry, and that she'd promised that he would get to eat as much as he wanted. With a groan, Bulma reflected that this was the first time in her life that she'd ever left a mall willingly. "Just shut up and get in the car," she said wearily, as she popped the car out of its capsule and hopped into the driver's seat. Raditz, realizing that she wasn't planning on taking him to yet another store and was, in fact, going back home, could only too happily comply, wholeheartedly thanking the Earth's Kami that the ordeal was finally over. After depositing the laundry in the bin by the washing machine, Bart went back to the bathroom to make sure that everything had been put back in place. Avoiding the puddles on the floor, he walked over to the tub and put the bars of soap in their holders, then capped the bottles of shampoo and set them on their shelf. With a final glance around the room, he nodded to himself and walked back out to the hall and headed towards the den where the children and his clothes were. The cool breeze, stirred up by his movement, brushed against his bare skin, making him shiver slightly. He guessed that it was early spring here on this world, judging by the growth of the vegetation and the chilly temperature of the air. As used to extreme climates as he was, he would still be glad to get some clothes on. If only there was something besides that tie-dyed shirt. Laughter from around the corner reached his sensitive ears, informing him that the boys were in the den and apparently enjoying the thrill of examining their new clothing. With his lips tugging into a faint smile, he rounded the corner and took in the scene before him. Trunks was currently wearing a miniature version of Raditz's burned baby shirt and some black jeans. Goku standing next to him, giggling at the purple-haired boy's outfit. The 7-year-old was only wearing a pair of tan shorts and was holding an equally bright yellow and green diamond print shirt in one hand. Bardock's eyes shifted to Goten and he did a double take. There was Goten turning his head so that he could get a good look at himself, wearing only the rainbow tie-dyed shirt that Bardock had been dreading so much. The shirt was way too large for him, but he didn't seem to care, looking as pleased as if he had discovered a truckload of burgers in his backyard. For some reason, the warrior found the sight utterly amusing and began to chuckle to himself, even as he spotted the lone pair of blue jeans in his size draped over the arm of the couch. He walked over and picked them up, preparing to pull them on, when he suddenly noticed Vegeta. The boy was standing off to the side, looking at him with eyes that radiated loneliness and betrayal, almost as if he had been about to decide something. But Bardock's sudden appearance had interrupted him. Even as the older Saiyan took note of this, the young prince's face shifted to a blank, expressionless mask that allowed no trace of emotion to leak through. And spinning on one heel, he stalked off in the direction of the kitchen. What was that all about? Bardock puzzled to himself, scratching the back of his head with his free hand while staring at the boy's retreating form. When Vegeta disappeared from view, Bardock shook his head in defeat and gave up that line of thought. With a shrug of his shoulders, he quickly pulled the pale blue jeans on and turned to face Goten. "Grandpa, look at the great night shirt I found." Goten squealed excitedly, floating up to eye level with Bardock so that the older man could get a good look at the rainbow-colored shirt. "It has all of my favorite colors, and they're so bright." The little boy's eyes danced with glee as he waited to hear his grandfather's opinion on the new shirt. Raising a hand to cover an amused smile, Bardock tried, somewhat unsuccessfully, to look serious as he appraised his grandson's new clothing. "It's very colorful," he said, truthfully, thinking that it was probably one of the biggest understatements of the century. Well, it looks like Goten likes that shirt. I didn't really want to wear it anyway, and I guess I can just go shirtless until Bulma and Raditz get back." I knew you'd like it. I'm gonna wear it tonight." The 8-year-old laughed happily and dropped back to the ground so he could continue his search for clothing. Bardock chuckled again, sitting down on the couch after moving a pile of clothes off one of the seats, and leaned back so he could watch the three boys play. Goku stood in ring, facing a strange old man with a mask on his face and a golden ring floating about his head. The boy was perhaps 12 or 13 years old, and still had his tail. Standing outside the fighting area were Master Roshi, Bulma, Krillin, Yamcha, a floating cat, a small boy that Bardock didn't know, and an old woman sitting on a floating ball. As he watched the fight progress, a spark of pride stirred in Bardock's heart. Goku had gotten so much stronger. In fact, he was winning against the old man. The masked fighter was on the ground and his son had a look of triumph on his face, and he had his guard down. In a flash, the old man had grabbed onto Goku's tail, rendering the child helpless, and held him upside down, saying something that Bardock couldn't hear. The others were speaking as well, their words also unheard due to the peculiar properties of the vision. Bardock gnawed his lip with worry as he watched his son dangle helplessly by his tail, knowing that it had to hurt terribly to be pulled like that. His worst fears came true when, all of a sudden, Goku's tail came off at the base and the little boy dropped to the ground. He danced around in pain for several moments, his face the picture of agony, until he managed to gain control of himself. Then a look of anger crossed his features, a look that Bardock could well understand. Hell, he'd be angry too, if someone had just pulled off his tail. As it was, he was pretty angry himself at whoever dared to pull of his son's tail. The old man dropped out of his fighting stance and said something that brought a startled expression of shock to the young Xian's face, who pointed at the man and gave an exclamation of surprise. Then the man pulled off his mask, revealing a kindly, gray, mustached face that smiled gently. Goku's eyes widened in stunned shock and recognition, his mouth forming a single word and then a look of purest joy lit up his face, and he dashed forward into the man's arms, shouting the word at what Bardock guessed was the top of his lungs, though it was hard to tell since he couldn't hear anything. Tears formed in the child's eyes as he latched onto the man's face and hugged him fiercely. A faint smile crossed his own face as he watched the reunion of his son and someone who must have meant a great deal to the boy, though he couldn't even guess who the old man might be. His son was happy, and that was all that mattered. "Daddy?" The vision faded away to nothing, and Bardock suddenly became aware of the concerned face of his son hovering in front of him. Goku was practically nose to nose with him, staring intently into his eyes in hopes of seeing them return to normal. When they finally did, the boy smiled with relief. "Daddy, your eyes are back to normal. They went white, and you were shivering, though you might have been cold, but your eyes were white. How'd you do that?" Seeing that his father was fine, relief and curiosity fairly bubbled over inside the 7-year-old Saiyan. Bardock blinked in surprise at his son's enthusiastic greeting, and a little bit of confusion. He'd never had anyone describe what he looked like when he was having one of his visions. "White eyes?" Shrugging to himself, he lifted Goku up and away from his face a little. "It's nothing to worry about," he said casually. "I sometimes have visions of the future, and when I do, I'm no longer aware of what's going on around me." He was feeling pretty good, actually, since the vision hadn't been one prophesying death and destruction, instead allowing him to see a happy moment in his son's life. Again, he hadn't been there, but he supposed there was a good explanation for it. "Could you tell us what you saw this time, Grandpa?" Goten piped up. He and Trunks had been sitting on the couch to either side of Bardock, both a little worried despite the fact that they knew what was going on with Bardock, but since the vision was over, they figured it was now fair game to question the man about it. A thoughtful look crossed Bardock's face as he thought back on what he'd seen. "Well, I'm not really sure what was going on, but I saw Goku fighting an old man and winning. The old man seemed to be someone you knew, though I've never seen him before," he added, speaking to his son. "You looked happy to see him." His eyes widening in awe, Goku could only stare at his father in amazement. "You can see the future, and you saw me? Cool." Happily settling into Bardock's lap, he looked up with admiration at his father's face. "Did you see anything else? This is so neat. My daddy can see the future." Amusement danced in the warrior's eyes, and he ruffled Goku's hair affectionately. "Yeah, I've seen other stuff. I saw you when you were pinned under that tree, which is how I found you." The amusement faded into a somber tone. "I thought you were dead. You see, the visions haven't ever been wrong before. Except once, when Goten traveled through time and rearranged the way things were supposed to happen. Fortunately for both of us, I was only misinterpreting that vision. You hadn't died yet, even if you looked like it." On impulse, Bardock pulled Goku into a tight embrace, which Goku contentedly returned by wrapping his arms around his father's neck. "I'm so glad I was wrong," Bardock whispered. The couch on Bardock's left shifted as Goten, feeling in need of a hug as well as wanting to comfort his grandpa, crawled closer to the older Saiyan and tried to his hug waist. Bardock smiled and shifted his arm to include Goten in the hug, then squeezed both boys to his chest, a feeling of peace and contentment washing over his mind and heart. "We're home!" Bulma's voice called out from the doorway, ending the moment shared by Bardock and his family. Bardock reluctantly let go of the two boys, waiting for them to crawl off his lap, before standing up and turning to face the blue-haired girl and his 15-year-old son as they walked into the room. The sight of his son still wearing that burn baby shirt and blue jeans, accompanied by bits of mayonnaise and relish in his hair, nearly sent Bardock off into peals of laughter. Giving his father a scowl, Raditz grumbled and popped the button on a capsule of clothing, tossing it to the ground to let another humongous pile of clothing appear on the floor, not caring that the room was already cluttered with children's clothes. Grabbing a plain blue t-shirt from the pile, he stalked off, not bothering to say anything to Bardock. He was still upset with him for leaving him with Bulma for half the day, and all he wanted now was to get a decent shower, not the kind you get by being dunked in a public fountain, and change out of these ridiculous clothes. "Yes! More clothes!" Goten cheered as he threw himself at the pile of clothing that Raditz had left behind, not caring that none of it was in his size. Seizing a shirt with swirls of aquamarine and golden yellow dancing all over it, he held it out to Goku. "Goku, you can have a nightshirt too." For some reason that Goku couldn't explain, the aquamarine and golden colors appealed to him, and he gleefully pulled off the yellow and green diamond shirt in favor of his new nightshirt. "I love it, Goten." "Thank you," he said, looking down at the oversized shirt. then gave his future son a hug before darting back into the heap of clothes to see if there were any more treasures to be found within it. Trunks, who had been sitting quietly on the couch for the past few minutes, grinned broadly and joined his two friends in the renewed fun. "So, did you and Raditz enjoy yourselves?" Bardock casually asked Bulma as he spotted one of the sea-green shirts he'd bought at the martial arts store lying half-hidden beneath a pair of boots. He walked over and picked it up, slipping it on over his head before turning around to face the girl again. That spark of fatherly mischief had come back, and he was eager to hear all about the torture he'd put his son through by leaving him in the hands of the little human female. "Oh, well, after you left, I took Raditz to a store that custom makes formal clothing and had the tailor make a tuxedo for him," Bulma replied, her eyes dancing with delight as she recalled the incident. "Raditz looked so handsome in that tux. Now I'll have to think of an excuse to get him to wear it again." "A tuxedo?" Bardock asked, the strange word rolling off his tongue oddly. "It's a... Oh, here, I'll just show you. Much easier than trying to describe it." The girl pulled out the capsule that held Raditz's tuxedo and popped out the black and white clothing, holding them up for Bardock to examine. "It's formal clothing for important parties and balls and things like that. It looks uncomfortable and restricting," the warrior said critically, eyeing the clothing with a hint of distaste. Still, the thought of his son having to wear it was amusing enough that he could forgive its other faults. "Well, it's not as uncomfortable as it looks, or so I'm told. But the point of wearing one of these isn't to be able to fight, but to dance, and it's made just right for that." "I see." Shrugging the matter off, he returned his attention to Bulma's face and continued his questioning. "What happened after that?" With a rueful smile on her face, Bulma went into detail about the biker shop incident, then told him about how Raditz had practically emptied the food court of everything edible before they finally headed back. "It's a pity, though. I never even got to take him to a hair salon. I bet he would look really cute with a crew cut. Or maybe a bowl cut. No, a buzz. Yes, a buzz would definitely look good on Raditz." Bardock didn't know whether to be mortified on behalf of his son at the thought of having his hair cut in any of those crazy Earth styles, or to laugh his head off at the mental pictures his imagination provided. Oh, poor Raditz. Maybe he shouldn't ever abandon Raditz like that again. It would be so humiliating for both of them to see him with a buzz. Before either of them could say anything else, though, Bardock's stomach pointedly reminded him that he hadn't had any food since breakfast that morning, and it was now getting very close to dinner time. I don't know about you, but I'm starving," Bardock said sheepishly, scratching the back of his neck in a very sunnish manner. "Me too," Goten chirped, popping out of the pile of clothing like a rabbit at the mention of food. "I haven't eaten since me and Trunks ate with my chibi mommy." That caught Bardock off guard. "What? Your mom? When did you and Trunks eat with your mom?" A sudden suspicion flickered inside Bardock's mind, and he gave the two Demi-Saiyans a stern look. "And where did you get those sensu beans, anyway? Did you two go off somewhere while we were gone after I asked you to help watch over Goku?" Goten and Trunks looked guiltily at their feet, looking for all the world like two children caught with their hands in the cookie jar. "Hi, Grandpa," Goten admitted, reluctantly. "We thought Goku was gonna die." Looking back up at his grandfather, his eyes shimmered with unshed tears. "I didn't want him to die, Grandpa." "And we got a Dragon Ball on the way, too," Trunks added enthusiastically. "We brought a radar with us, and there was a Dragon Ball really close by, so we decided to get it on the way. It's the one-star ball." My mommy had it, so we got to meet her, and my grandpa, Ox King, and eat lunch with her too. My mom is the best cook ever." Thinking back on what had happened, he turned to Goku and said, "And she told me to remind you that you promised to get married with her." "Huh?" Goku blinked owlishly, scratching the back of his head in confusion. "Wait a second," Bulma yelped, eyes widening in surprise. "Your grandpa is the Ox King? That would make Chi-Chi your mother. Goku and Chi-Chi get married?" "Oh, I remember now," Goku crowed in triumph. "Chi-Chi told me about that. It's a kind of food, right? I promised Chi-Chi I'd get some married with her." The next time I saw her, a huge grin plastered itself across his face, and his stomach rumbled at the thought of food. Both Bulma and Bardock gaped in dumbfoundment at the naive little 7-year-old. "You don't know what marriage is?" Bulma asked faintly. "No." "Does it taste good?" Goku asked innocently. "No, you baka." Bulma rolled her eyes in exasperation. "Marriage is where you spend the rest of your life with someone and have kids together. It is not a kind of food. Blinking curiously for a moment as he absorbed this information, Goku tilted his head to one side. "Ooh," he said, a look of dawning comprehension on his face. "But I promised Chi-Chi I'd get married with her. And a promise is a promise. So, when am I supposed to start living with her?" Scratching the back of his head, he was startled to notice that both his father and Bulma had suddenly blanched. "Goku," Bardock said at last, fighting with laughter at his son's naivete and failing to keep a straight face. "Marriage isn't something you're supposed to do until you're grown up. Okay?" "Okay," Kozen, the boy, happily agreed, the matter already all but forgotten. "Can we go eat now?" Bardock couldn't help it. His son's innocence and cluelessness, combined with the Saiyan-like question, were just too much for him to handle. He threw his head back and laughed, an action that startled Bulma. After all, she'd never seen him completely give in to any light-hearted emotions in front of her, like this. Grinning broadly, the older Saiyan swept his son off the ground and settled him onto his shoulders. "Yes, let's go eat," he agreed, taking Goten's hand and setting off towards the kitchen, followed by Trunks and Bulma. Vegeta lay in bed, staring moodily up at the ceiling with his hands behind his head as he replayed the events of the day in his mind. Two scenes seemed to stand out in his memory, switching from one to the other without any direction from his conscious thoughts. One was the image of an injured Kakarot sleeping on blood-stained sheets, unclothed and uncovered. Why had he pulled those blankets back up over him? What did he care if the brat was cold or not? It's not like it even mattered to him whether Kakarot lived or not, right? The other scene was of the incident later that afternoon. Trunks, Goten, and Kakarot had been having so much fun trying on those ridiculous clothes, completely at ease with each other, and Vegeta couldn't help but wonder what it was like to be so carefree. He had wanted so much to join them in their play, to participate in their pointless conversations, hell, even try on one or two of those shirts. It didn't matter. He had just wanted to be with others. Like him. A lump of emotion formed in the young prince's throat, which he quickly swallowed, rolling onto his side to stare out the window and up at the twinkling stars in the night sky. Clutching a fistful of the blankets to his chest, he curled up into a little ball and exhaled softly, and then Bardock had come. Ruining the moment right as he had been about to make his decision. He wanted to hate Bardock for that, but for some reason, he couldn't. It hadn't really been the older Saiyan's fault that Vegeta was so weak. No, the blame for that rested squarely on Vegeta's shoulders. The only problem was the 10-year-old boy couldn't figure out what it was that made him weak. Was it weak to want to play with other children, to associate with members of a lower class, or had he been weak in allowing Bardock's presence to stop him from following through on his desires? It was one or the other, but Vegeta didn't know which it was. All he knew was that he had been unforgivably weak, and the Saiyajin no Uji must never be weak. But which action was the sin? He whispered to himself, doubt gnawing on the edges of his soul. He needed to know what he had done that had made him into such a weakling, or else he could never rectify the situation. He needed someone he could talk to, someone who was familiar with the burdens and responsibilities of being a prince of a warrior race, who would know what things made you weak and what things made you strong. He needed his dad. But father is dead. A sharp stinging in his eyes told him that he was about to commit another crime, and he hastily scrubbed the tears away before they could form. Drawing in a shuddering breath, he crawled out of the bed and opened the window, hoping that perhaps the cool night breeze would help him regain his composure. The air whispered into the room, stirring the oversized white shirt that he wore and brushing against his skin until he wrapped his arms around himself and shivered. Closing his eyes, he faced the wind head-on, not caring that his skin was prickling with goosebumps from the cold. The chill air seemed to clear his mind, allowing him to think without distraction, and suddenly he realized something. There was someone he could talk to. With a newfound resolve, the little Saiyan padded out of the room until he came to the bedroom door of the person who could help him. A wave of uncertainty rippled through him as he lifted his hand to open the door, knowing that once he stepped inside that room, he couldn't turn back. His own pride would force him to follow through with his plan, and he would have to bare his soul to the person on the other side of that door. Straightening his back with determination, Vegeta laid his hand on the handle and turned it, quietly pushing the door open and stepping through before allowing it to swing shut behind him. "Grandpa!" Goten cried out, shooting upright in bed so suddenly he nearly fell onto the floor. Shivering and crying, he stared around wildly until he finally realized where he was. Tears streamed down the little boy's face, which he didn't bother to wipe away. and he clambered out of the bed, sobbing. The nightmare had been so vivid he would have sworn it was real if his eyes weren't telling him otherwise. Thinking about the nightmare, he shuddered and ran over to the door of his room, pulling it open so he could dash down the hall to his grandfather's room. He had to make sure that it was only a dream and that his grandpa was okay. Without even bothering to close the door after him, he darted into the darkened room and crawled into Bardock's bed so he could look at the sleeping warrior's face. His whole body began to shake with relief when he confirmed that the Saiyan was only asleep and not dead, as he had feared. Not caring if he woke his grandfather up, Goten threw himself into the man's arms, sobbing gratefully as he buried his face in the other's neck with tears still sliding down his cheeks. At first, Bardock didn't seem to notice and lay unreacting on the bed. Then all at once his eyes flew open and he gasped. Noticing Goten desperately clinging to his neck, he ignored the impulse to sit up, instead lifting a hand to rub his grandson's back. He didn't know why Goten was crying, but he felt he needed to do something to comfort him. Not waiting for his grandpa to ask what was wrong, Goten sobbed out. "I had a nightmare, Grandpa, and I saw you die, and Vegeta has hurt you, and Goku and Uncle Raditz were dead too. I had the same dream." Bardock turned his head to look at the doorway and found Goku standing there in his new nightshirt, looking a little sleepy and upset at the same time. As Goku tottered over to the bed, Bardock sat up, still holding Goten, and patted the spot next to him. Hopping up onto the bed, the 7-year-old looked up at his father with disturbed eyes. "It was scary," he said softly, leaning into Bardock's embrace. "There was smoke and fire and everyone was dead." The boy sniffled and rubbed his eyes. "Bulma and Oni-chan and you, Sen, and everyone," he trailed off, miserably, not really knowing how to describe what he had seen. For several long moments, Bardock said nothing, a troubled look on his face even as he hugged the two children. "They had the same dream as me. Only mine wasn't a dream. But how did they see the vision when I'm the one cursed with seeing the future? Have we really grown that close? Or was I somehow broadcasting my vision to them? Or what if the curse can be transferred? After all, that damn alien transferred it to me, didn't he? What if I inadvertently passed it on to Goku and Goten?" A shudder of dread swept through him at the thought of these two innocent children. Witnessing the terrible things he'd been seeing, and he quickly shoved his concerns to the back of his mind. Now was not the time to dwell on what-ifs. "It's all right, it's okay," he murmured to them, stroking their backs simultaneously. He wanted to tell them that it had only been a nightmare, that none of it was true, but he couldn't bring himself to lie to them. Even so, he decided not to tell them that it had been a vision of the future. There was no need to scare them like that, and he still wasn't sure what these dual visions meant, if one set was true and the other false, or if they were both true. Until he could determine why he was seeing visions that seemed to contradict each other, it would be best to keep silent about them. And as for the possibility of accidentally passing on the visions to either of them, well, it might only be a fluke. Best wait and see if they keep having visions, or if this was a one-time thing. He continued to make comforting sounds, not really saying anything intelligent, just speaking for the sake of letting them hear his voice. Eventually their distress ebbed away, and they snuggled into his arms, their breathing becoming slower, steadier, until they drifted off into more pleasant dreams. Sighing with relief, Bardock leaned back into his pillow and stared up at the ceiling, wondering if he would get any more sleep this night. He didn't really think so. He had too much on his mind now to possibly have any chance of settling down enough to be able to fall asleep. Swirling through his head were thoughts of the visions and their possible meanings, and now worries about why the two boys in his arms were getting his visions. With his mind thinking this furiously, it would be impossible to get it to slow down enough to get any decent amount of sleep. Oh well, he'd survive. Carefully pulling the blankets back over himself, his son, and his grandson without waking either of them, he prepared for a long night of wakefulness, and promptly fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. Vegeta hesitantly walked over to the bed where the 9-year-old boy was sleeping, trying to maintain a steady grip on his resolve as he reached a hand out to rest it on the other boy's shoulder. The lavender-haired kid was sprawled out on his bed, the sheets only halfway covering his body, and he was snoring softly through his open mouth. Seeing that his future son wasn't reacting to his light touch, the dark-haired prince shook him slightly. "Trunks?" he said softly, almost whispering. Grumbling in his sleep, Trunks' eyelids fluttered briefly before he resumed his snoring, one hand unconsciously lifting to scratch an imaginary itch on his neck before flopping back down on the bed. A look of mild annoyance and determination crossed Vegeta's features, and he shook Trunks again, roughly enough that the other boy's head lolled from side to side. At last, the Demisaiyan's eyes cracked open enough to search for whatever was interrupting his sleep, a flicker of surprise flashing across his face as he realized who had woken him up. "Vegeta, what are you doing here?" he mumbled, sitting up in bed and turning to face his chibi father. Instead of answering immediately, Vegeta crawled onto Trunks' bed and sat down, hugging his knees to his chest while curling his tail around his ankles. He rested his chin on one knee and stared at the younger child, feeling more vulnerable than he ever had before. "I need to talk to someone," he said at last, locking his gaze onto Trunks' startled blue eyes. He had thought that he could keep the emotion out of his voice, but a note of loneliness still crept in. Curious and just a little bit concerned by what he heard in Vegeta's voice, Trunks tucked his legs under him, cross-legged, and looked attentively at the Saiyan sitting across from him. "What about?" he asked, cautiously, searching his chibi father's face for any sign of what he was feeling. Taking a deep breath, Vegeta plunged directly into the matter. "I need to know if I'm—" he faltered for a moment, then stoically continued, "If I'm weak." Before Trunks could so much as open his mouth, he hurried to explain, the words tumbling from his mouth, as though a floodgate somewhere inside him had been opened. "You see, earlier today I wanted to play with you and Goten and Kakarot, and before that, I tucked Kakarot in bed and watched over him while everyone was gone. And they're both of third-class lineage, even if you're not, and I'm the Saya, Jin, no, Uji." He looked down miserably at the rumpled bedsheets. His next words were filled with all the emotional torment and pain that he was feeling, no longer held in check, but there for his son to plainly see. "Am I weak, Trunks? To want to play? To play with a third class? To care? To care if he's hurt, or cold, or if he dies? And was it weak to run away from playing with you when Bardock came in?" A single tear slid from his left eye, unnoticed, as the young prince repeated himself, pleading with the other boy for an answer to his fears. "Am I weak?" Trunks was stunned. He could feel his jaw dropping open slightly as he stared at the boy who would one day be his father, amazed at what he was hearing and seeing. Vegeta was asking if he was weak, and, crying, his mind finally caught up with the information he was receiving, and he shook his head vehemently. "Vegeta, if you're weak, then so am I. I mean, I'm a prince of the Saiyans, too, and your son, and I play with Goten and Goku all the time. In fact, Goten's been my best friend my whole life, and it's okay to care what happens to people, no matter what class they supposedly are. After all, my dad, he loves my mom, even though he doesn't say it, but I can tell. And mom's really weak, she's a genius, but she couldn't form a ki blast if her life depended on it, and playing isn't weak. Playing is what kids are supposed to do." A thoughtful look crossed the boy's face, and he added, "I guess you don't know that, though, since you probably had to act strong in front of your dad and Frieza." He was guessing blindly there, since his dad didn't really talk about his childhood much, but it made sense. A tiny gleam of hope shone briefly in Vegeta's eyes, at Trunks' words, only to be snuffed out like a candle in the wind. "But I ran away," he grated out, harshly, squeezing his eyes shut against the tears that threatened to follow the first one. "I was going to play with you and the others when Bardock came in, and I ran away." Feelings of self-hate, despair, and loneliness drenched his soul like a cold rain, and he couldn't hold the tears back any longer. Burying his face in his knees, he cried helplessly, ashamed of his weakness and ashamed of his tears. "You're wrong," Trunks stated softly, yet firmly, hesitantly reaching a hand out to his young father's shoulder. Vegeta lifted his tear-streaked face to stare at Trunks, and the younger boy smiled encouragingly. "You're not weak. You're the strongest person I know. You've just never admitted that you have any feelings, so even though you were willing to open up a little when it was just me and Goten and Goku, it doesn't mean you were ready to show emotions around older people like Bardock. My dad still has problems with that. He wouldn't admit that he cared about anyone until he was about to die, and even then, He didn't say or do much beyond hug me and say he was proud of me and to tell Mom that he loved her. Emotions aren't bad, Vegeta, unless you let them control your actions to the point where your brain doesn't have any say in the matter. In a sudden, daring move to prove his point, Trunks leaned forward and gave the surprised prince a quick hug, then settled back to see if his words and actions had had any effect on Vegeta. Vegeta stared at the other boy's face, searching it for any sign that he might be lying, or just saying things to soothe the prince's pain without really meaning any of it. All he saw was honesty and sincerity and pride. Trunks' face radiated pride in Vegeta. Surprised that, even after showing the powerful Demi-Saiyan just how weak he was, Trunks could feel proud of him. Vegeta could only nod wordlessly to let the boy from the future know that he had taken the words to heart. Having nothing else to say, Vegeta glanced at the door, reluctantly realizing that it was probably time for him to leave. Looking back at the purple-haired chibi, though, the 10-year-old bowed his head, focusing on his fidgeting hands as he worked up the courage to ask Trunks one last question. "Can I stay with you tonight?" he asked hesitantly, lifting his head high enough so he could see how the other boy reacted to his request. I don't want to be alone anymore." In response, Trunks grinned and scooted over to make room for Vegeta, wriggling under the covers and laying his head on the pillow, knowing that anything he said would only embarrass the young prince. Relief and gratitude filled Vegeta's heart, and he smiled back faintly as he crawled over to the other side of the bed and got under the blankets, glad that Trunks seemed to know him so well. Silence reigned for a few minutes, then, "Hey, Vegeta. Yeah. Do you want to play tag tomorrow?" "Hey? Okay." Awareness slowly dawned on Bardock in the form of a low grumbling in his stomach. Not so loud as to wake the boys, but it was insistent enough to drag the warrior out of the land of dreams and into reality. Blinking his eyes open to greet the darkness that surrounded him, he realized that the sun hadn't risen yet, though, judging by the faint light that was coming from the window, it wouldn't be dark for long. Despite his stomach's protests, Bardock didn't really want to get up just yet. The vision from last night was still haunting him, images of his son's broken bodies flashing through his mind. So he was feeling rather protective of the children in his arms, and didn't want to let them go, even if Goku was drooling on his chest. As another picture of Goku's mangled corpse flashed before his mind's eyes, Bardock suddenly realized that it wasn't necessarily his son's body that he was seeing. Goku and Goten looked so much alike that it would be impossible to tell them apart merely by looking, despite the slight age difference, especially considering how badly the boy in the dream had been butchered. Even though the impression he received in the visions was that the dead boy was Goku, it could just as easily be his grandson lying on the rocky ground in a pool of blood. Neither possibility was a pleasant one, and he shivered with apprehension even as he squeezed the two chibis gently, as though he could avert the dark future he'd seen simply by clutching these two a little more tightly. Eventually, though, Bardock's stomach began to override his other inclinations, darkly promising that if he did not do something to appease his hunger, it would make enough noise to disturb the sleeping children. Sighing reluctantly, the Saiyan warrior let go of the lookalikes and slipped out of the bed as carefully as possible so as not to wake his son or his grandson. Bardock rubbed one hand over his bare chest where his youngest son had drooled on him, then wiped his hand on one of the sheets before pulling them back up over the blissfully sleeping boys. With a stifled yawn, Bardock grabbed a loose-fitting pair of black pants, the now clean weighted black undershirt, a sea green overshirt, and the weighted wristbands and boots that he had set aside before going to bed, quickly pulling them on before leaving the room. Feeling more awake with each step, he eagerly walked down the hall towards the kitchen, thoughts of food crowding his other concerns to the back of his mind. After all, there wasn't much he could do about them now, and there was something he could do about his hunger. As he rummaged through the capsules of food, he picked one that held mostly fish and popped it open. Figuring that he had plenty of time before any of the others woke up, he decided to put his mediocre cooking skills to use in making breakfast. He hadn't actually made a meal since he and Goten had eaten in his apartment a couple weeks ago, so he was a little rusty, but it wasn't anything to be concerned about. After all, he wasn't trying to make anything complex, just a lot of fried fish. A frown darkened his features a little as he suddenly realized that they really only had various kinds of meat stored in the capsules. No vegetables or fruits. He'd have to speak with the others about that when they came in for breakfast. The smells of cooking fish quickly drew the presence of Raditz, who appeared to have already been awake for a while. since he was dressed in a solid maroon G-belted at the waist with a black sash, though he was currently barefoot. Bardock wasn't certain, but he thought he caught a flicker of relief in his son's eyes, as the boy unconsciously ran a hand over the comfortable material. No doubt, glad to be back in normal clothing, Bardock mused to himself, a faint smile tugging at the corner of one lip. Can't blame him, though. I'm rather happy to be wearing something besides those blue jeans myself. Too tight, too restricting, and they chaffed. "Good morning, Raditz," Bardock commented, curious to see if his son had forgiven him yet for abandoning him with Bulma. He scraped an almost burnt fish off the frying pan and onto the growing pile of cooked fish and quickly laid another raw fish on the pan before glancing at the teen to see his reaction to the greeting. Apparently Raditz still wasn't speaking to his father, because he simply sat down at the table and waited silently, though every once in a while casting a furtive look of anticipation at the food his father was preparing. Shaking his head in amusement, Bardock turned back to his cooking. A rumbling from the direction of the kitchen table drew the warrior's attention, and chuckling, he turned to face the younger Saiyan. Smirking broadly, Bardock waved the spatula at 15-year-old. "Well, at least your stomach's still on speaking terms with me," he chortled irreverently, grinning as he saw the faint flush of embarrassment spread across Raditz's cheeks. "You're one to talk," Raditz grumbled irritably. "From the way your gut's been talking all morning, you'd think it was trying to set off a small earthquake." Realizing he'd just broken his vow of silence towards his father, he quickly snapped his jaws shut and glared at the older man. "True," Bardock laughed cheerfully, inwardly pleased in his victory in tricking the boy into saying something to him. "You know, there's probably enough fish ready to start feeding everyone. Why don't you wake Bulma and the boys up, so we can all eat together?" The words were hardly out of Bardock's mouth before Raditz was out of his chair and darting through the kitchen door towards the bedrooms. The moment his son's back disappeared through the door, the cheerful facade fell from the warrior's face, and he simply stood there for a moment, staring with somber eyes at the spot where his son had been sitting moments before. His memory called up images of Raditz's body lying alongside his little brother's, if indeed the boy was Goku, and he couldn't help but wonder how much time lay between now and that terrible future he kept seeing. "Stop that," he told himself firmly, turning back to the frying pan before the fish in it could burn too badly. "You don't know if that future will even happen. After all, there is that second set of contradicting visions, the one showing Goku and his friends growing up happily." Bardock's movements slowed as a thoughtful look crossed his face. Scooping the partially burned fish out of the pan and on top of the other fish, his mind barely paid attention to what he was doing, focusing instead on the idea that had sparked to life. "What if I'm seeing two possible futures?" he murmured to himself, absent-mindedly, throwing another one of the raw earth creatures into his sizzling frying pan. "Yes, I know that all my other visions have shown certain futures, but I haven't really had this curse all that long. I don't know if single, unchangeable futures are all that I can see. What if there is a decision or an event coming up that, depending on the outcome, could result in one or the other of these futures? That would mean..." Hope danced inside him, and he suddenly had the urge to grin insanely. "That would mean that my sons don't necessarily die, or me, or any of the other people on this planet." He wanted to dance giddily with relief and joy, but a more serious thought wiped that impulse away. "But what is the choice? And how will I know which way to decide? Will I even realize when that choice is laid before me, or whoever it is who has to make the decision?" The smell of burning fish drew his attention back to the pan, and with no small amount of chagrin, he pushed his troubled and hopeful speculations aside so he could concentrate on salvaging what was left of the charred flesh in the pan. "Idiot," he berated himself. "Never think while you're trying to cook. You only get bad cooking, and you have to eat bad cooking." Uttering a few more choice curses in reference to himself and his intelligence, he chiseled the burnt fish onto a separate plate. His motto had always been, "You burn it, you eat it," figuring that if he had to deal with the consequences of irresponsibility in regards to food, he might actually learn his lesson and remember not to let it happen again. With a growl of annoyance, he placed another fish in the pan, determined to pay attention this time. When Raditz poked his head into his little brother's room, he was mildly surprised to find that the boy was not in there, though the rumpled sheets attested to the fact that Goku must have slept in the room at some point. Not really concerned, Raditz shrugged his shoulders and went on to Goten's room, only to find that his nephew's bed was also empty. Feeling slightly puzzled, the teenager poked his head into the next room, Bardock's room, and walked in when he found both spiky-haired boys curled up next to each other and snoring softly. The only way he could tell which was the difference in their shirts, both of which had been bought for Bardock by Bulma. A little smile lifted the corners of Raditz's mouth as he watched the two for a moment, thinking about the sparring match he'd had with little Goku not too long ago. Despite how relatively weak the boy was right now, he definitely had potential, and Raditz felt it was his brotherly duty to help him realize that potential. Maybe I can spar with you again after breakfast. See if nearly dying made you any stronger. I bet I could teach you some neat tricks, too, little brother. Recalling the look of admiration his Gokus had had in his eyes after being defeated by Raditz, the teenager chuckled and hesitantly ruffled his brother's hair, determining that he would find time today to train the boy. Shifting his glance to his brother's look-alike son, Raditz could only shake his head ruefully. Goten looked so much like Goku, and yet their strength was so drastically different that it was hard to believe that he could be Goku's son from the future. Raditz didn't really know how to behave towards the boy. On the one hand, he was family, and younger than the teenager, which would ordinarily entitle Raditz with a higher rank in terms of how he treated Goten. But on the other hand, Goten was so incredibly strong that the older boy found it difficult to imagine even teasing him. So far he'd been avoiding the child as much as possible so he wouldn't have to deal with the dilemma. But he knew he would eventually have to decide how he would interact with his nephew. A low growl from his stomach suddenly reminded Raditz of his priorities. Laying a hand on either boy's shoulder, he briskly shook them as he smiled mischievously and yelled, "Wake up, you two. Father's cooking breakfast." Both boys' eyes shot open simultaneously, twin looks of eager anticipation on their faces as they bolted upright. "Breakfast? Where?" Goku was already crawling out of bed, looking this way and that for the promised food, while Goten rubbed his eyes and grinned broadly. "Yay, food," the older chibi cheered, jumping up and down on the bed in his excitement. With a final bounce, he leapt off the bed and landed next to Goku. Both boys looked expectantly at Raditz to see if he had anything else to tell them. "Go on, get out of here," the teenager said in a tone of mock gruffness. "I still have to wake the others up." Not needing to be told twice, the lookalikes raced out the door, not bothering to change out of their nightshirts in their haste to get to the table before the food had a chance to disappear. Even if they don't act siak-siachin. Most of the time, they still have siak-siachin appetites. At least. Raditz smirked to himself and walked out of his father's bedroom, intending on waking Prince Vegeta up next. Upon leaving the bedroom, though, he was blinked in surprise when he found that both Vegeta and Trunks were standing in the hall in the oversized shirts they'd gotten from Bardock's newly acquired clothing, talking quietly to each other until they caught sight of Raditz. At Raditz's appearance, Vegeta looked almost guilty, and he abruptly turned on heel and retreated towards the kitchen. Trunks cast an annoyed glance in Raditz's direction before following his chibi father, quickening his pace so he could catch up to him before they reached their destination. What was that all about? The 15-year-old boy puzzled, staring after the two as they disappeared around a corner. After only a moment of contemplation, he gave that line of thought up as a lost cause and headed for his final destination. The one that he really would rather not go to at all, Bulma's room. Cursing softly to himself at his misfortune, Raditz determinedly walked up to the little Anna's door with the look of one facing certain death. Quickly catching up to Vegeta, Trunks turned his head to give the older boy a serious look. "Come on, Vegeta. I mean it. You said you didn't want to be alone anymore, right?" "I did, but that doesn't mean I'm willing to degrade myself like that." Vegeta bristled, slowing to a halt so they could finish the conversation before reaching the kitchen. Folding his arms across his chest, he scowled at the lavender-haired boy and continued his protest. "Besides, I don't see why I'd have to say any such thing. Because it's kinda your fault Goku got hurt in the first place." Rolling his eyes in exasperation, Trunks folded his arms in an unconscious mirror of his father. "And it's not like you'd have to say it in front of everyone. Just Goku. And you know Goku, he wouldn't rub it in or anything. Anyway, you can't be friends with someone you've hurt like that and not apologize for what you did." "And who says I want to be friends with that third class?" the black-haired boy muttered angrily, glaring at the floor so he wouldn't have to meet Trunks' piercing blue eyes. "Vegeta, you don't have much choice if you want to have a friend at all. After Goten and I leave, just how many Saiyan kids are you going to be able to play with? And how many of them would treat you like a playmate, and not the Saiyan Kyozi no Uji? If you don't apologize to Goku and make friends with him as soon as Goten and I go home, You're going to be alone again. Unable to refute Trunks' insight about his prospects for friendship, Vegeta silently fumed for a few moments, looking anywhere except at the Demi-Saiyan in front of him. I still don't see why I have to apologize to him, he grumbled at last. That's the way friendship is, Vegeta. You have to make amends for your actions if you ever want to really be friends. If you don't apologize to him, neither of you will be able to put it behind you. And, yes, Trunks added before Vegeta could open his mouth to say something, even if it is Goku we're talking about, you still need to apologize. Goku might forgive you, even if you don't, but he'll still remember that you didn't. And trust me, that'll hurt him more in the long run than telling him that he killed his grandpa. Vegeta appeared to think this over for a few moments before sighing and dropping his arms to his sides. Shrugging uncomfortably, he shook his head. I'm not promising to do it, but I'll think about it, okay? Not waiting for Trunks to reply, he started walking again, not wanting to continue the conversation anymore. Raditz stared blankly at the red-faced girl in front of him. Confusion etched clearly into his own features. He just didn't get the problem. All he'd done was come in to wake her up. So why was she so mad? He would have thought she'd be glad to be informed that it was breakfast time, especially since she had to vie with 6 Saiyajin males for food. After all, if he'd let her stay in bed until she came out on her own, there probably wouldn't be any food left at all. His train of thought was interrupted by Bulma's enraged screams and a thrown shoe that he narrowly dodged. I'm naked, you idiot. Don't you have any decency? You don't just waltz into a girl's room without knocking. What? Raditz asked, even more confused now than before. But you're not naked, he said, pointing at Bulma's underwear and bra, which made Bulma flush a bright shade of crimson and hastily yank on a pink t-shirt. And why would it matter if I see you naked anyway? I mean, you're only a little girl. Whatever threats or angry protests Bulma had been prepared to launch died in her open mouth, tears of hurt and betrayal threatening to spill from her eyes. No longer seeming to care about her state of semi-undress, the 11-year-old sank to her bed, staring dumbfoundedly at her crush for several long moments as what he had just said sank in. A lone tear trickled from one periwinkle eye, and suddenly her face became furious. Get out! Get out! Get out! She shrieked, grabbing the other shoe and hurling it with all her might at the teenager's head. Get out, or damn it to hell, I'll kill you! Yelping as the second shoe whizzed, followed closely by a hairbrush and bottle of nail polish. Raditz hastily fled the room, still confused by Bulma's reaction, but knowing better than to stick around and ask. He didn't understand what exactly he'd done to deserve any of that, but he mused, shaking his head in defeat. He figured that he would never really understand that crazy little Anna. In the meantime, though, there was always breakfast. Realizing that he had accomplished his duty in waking everyone up, the hungry teenage Saiyan hurried back towards the kitchen, and the source of the smell of cooked fish. The prospect of food was enough to brighten any situation. Despite the fact that he'd burned a few of the fish and would be faced with having to eat them himself, Bardock was feeling more cheerful than he had in days, specifically since the visions come back to haunt him. It was a lot less depressing to think that a dark future might happen if he made a poor decision at some point, than to think that the same future would happen, no matter what he did. Even with the weight of the responsibility of discovering that choice dampening his mood somewhat, he would at least have a chance to avert the disaster he'd foreseen, and that was definitely cause for celebration in his eyes. On top of all that, ever since he'd set aside his concerns, he'd quit burning as many fish. In fact, some of them looked downright appetizing. Scooping another almost perfect fish off of the pan and onto the 6th heaping plate, he glanced over at the table to find that Goku and Goten were just barely sitting down, still dressed in their colorful nightshirts, and grinning happily in anticipation of a good breakfast. After tossing another fish into the pan, the older Saiyan picked up 2 of the heaping plates and set them down in front of each boy. Good morning, Goku, Goten, he greeted them, ruffling the hair on each boy's head, affectionately before going back to bring the other plates of fish to the table. It would probably be only a matter of minutes before Trunks, Vegeta, Raditz, and Bulma joined them, so it'd be best to set out all the food now. Ah, hi you, Grandpa, Goten chirped, followed closely by Goku's enthusiastic "Ahayu Tuasen" before the two began to stuff their faces with fish, their hands a blur of motion as they shoveled food into their mouths as quickly as possible. They either didn't notice or didn't care that some of the fish were a little charred on the edges, wolfing each one down indiscriminately as though it was the best thing they'd ever tasted. By the time Bardock had brought the last plate out, Trunks and Vegeta had joined the two at the table and were now doing their best to make their own dents in the mountain of fried fish. Bardock was about to turn around and go back to cooking the rest of the fish, but paused and took another look at the two new arrivals. Something was different. He couldn't quite put his finger on it, but there was a subtle shift in the atmosphere that hadn't been there before this morning. Furrowing his brow in puzzlement, the warrior examined first Trunks, then Vegeta, in search of some sign or subtle clue as to what had changed. After a moment of observation, the only thing he could determine was that Vegeta kept casting wary looks at Trunks, Goku. His whole demeanor was quieter, moody, contemplative. There was something on his mind, and Bardock would bet his tail that it had something to do with Trunks and Goku. The only question was what it was and how it would affect Bardock and his family. Unable to discover any more about whatever it was that was troubling Vegeta, Bardock shook his head in frustration and turned back to his cooking, noting mournfully that he had nearly burned another fish. With a sigh, he flipped the barely edible thing out of the pan and onto his plate, then turned the stove off, since it looked like he had cooked enough fish to feed everyone. "Get out! Get out! Get out!" Bardock's head snapped up as Bulma's piercing, anger-filled screams shook the house to its foundations. If capsule houses had foundations, and he turned around to look in the direction of the disturbance. "Get out, or damn it to hell, I'll kill you." A few moments later, Raditz scampered in through the door, looking confused, but relatively unconcerned, as he sat down at the table and immediately began to chow down. "What was that all about?" Bardock asked his son, lifting one eyebrow questioningly, loading his arms with cups before walking over to the table to set them down. "I don't really know," the teenager said between mouthfuls. "I walked in to tell her that breakfast was ready, and she just started screaming. Something about being naked. But I don't understand that part. She wasn't naked. She was wearing one of those female bathing suits." Shrugging the matter off, he lifted a large bite of fish to his mouth and went back to eating. "You walked in on Bulma when she was changing," Trunks exclaimed, pausing in mid-bite to stare incredulously at the older boy. "You're lucky to be alive, Raditz. She practically took my head off the last time I did that to her, and I'm hers." The boy gulped when he realized just how close he'd come to slipping up and revealing he was Bulma's son in front of Vegeta. "Her, friend," he finished lamely. "Oh," was all Raditz said, not noticing Trunks's verbal stumbling. After a few moments of staring at his fish and trying to puzzle out the information he'd just received, "So humans have a strong taboo against nudity?" he asked, looking to Trunks for an answer. When the lavender-haired Demi nodded, the teenager frowned. "Humans are strange. They have a taboo against nudity, and yet are perfectly willing to wear clothing in public that shows almost everything." Here he was referring to the swimsuit contest. "But if you walk into a human's room while they're wearing the same thing, they'll throw a fit." Raditz?" Bulma wasn't wearing a bathing suit, Trunks stated, blushing a little. "That was underwear, and humans also have a taboo against being seen in only their underwear. That's why Bulma got mad." Raditz stared disbelievingly at the other boy for a few moments. "But what's the difference?" he asked, exasperation tinging his voice. In fact, what that little Anna was wearing was more modest than some of the things those other females were wearing at the swimsuit contest. A drop of sweat rolled down the back of Trunks' neck, and he shrugged uncomfortably. "I never really understood it myself. That's just the way it is." He picked at his food with his chopsticks, feeling rather odd about talking about his mother in her underwear. "Humans are crazy," Raditz stated firmly, then snorted in disgust as he turned back to his food, pursing his lips in thought. Bardock walked back to the kitchen to fill a large pitcher with water. As the thing was filling up, he made a mental note to add beverages to the grocery list he was compiling in his head. Water was all well and good, but drinking nothing but that would get old quickly. Once the pitcher was full, he picked it up and walked back to the table in time to see Bulma enter the room, her eyes red as though she'd been crying, but her head held high. This behavior instantly raised suspicions in Bardock's mind that Raditz had not told everything that had happened. From what he understood, the boy had only walked in on Bulma in an embarrassing moment, but she was acting as though the teenager had done something to break her heart. "Good morning, Bardock, Goten, Trunks, and you too, Vegeta." Bulma greeted them with a cheerfulness that sounded forced. Her failure to mention Raditz was highly conspicuous, and when she deliberately sat as far from the wild Maine teen as she could, Bardock knew that something had definitely happened. Bulma was no longer infatuated with his oldest son, and while that didn't really bother the scarred warrior, since he knew that Bulma would eventually, well, hopefully, partner with Vegeta, he still wanted to know why. Ribtits eyed Bulma warily, thinking that her lack of pestering was almost too good to be true. No puppy love eyes. No offers to be helpful in some way or other, not sitting next to him and trying to attract his attention. It was a breakfast that the Siang had only been able to dream about ever since he had first met the strange human girl, what seemed like months ago, but was, in reality, about 3 days. Smiling cheerfully, the teenager grabbed a pitcher and poured some water into his glass, downing the cool liquid in a single gulp. He was about to stand up from the table and head outside to warm up in preparation for the spar with Goku he had planned, when his father interrupted him. I was originally thinking that we could get on with the hunt for the other 4 Dragon Balls, Bardock began, bringing everyone's attention to his scarred face. However, this morning I noted that we have very little in the way of food other than meat, and since we're still close to a city, it would be wise to take advantage of it while we can. Bulma, he caught her gaze with his own to make sure she was paying attention. I know you've already spent quite a lot of money on us, but... No, you don't even have to ask, Bulma interrupted him, a small smile forming on her previously serious lips. It'd be my pleasure to pay for the food. After all, Goku is my friend, and you're his family, and... She paused, glancing at Trunks and Vegeta, and his friends. With a grateful smile on his face, Bardock nodded and said, Thank you, Bulma. Would you like someone to go with you to help you determine the quantities you need to buy things in? After all, Saiyajin eat a lot more than humans. I was planning on training with Goku, Raditz hastily interjected, anxious to excuse himself from the possibility of being picked to accompany the blue-haired terror on yet another shopping trip. He was even prepared to grab his little brother and shamelessly flee in order to avoid that prospect. I wasn't planning on asking you, Bulma retorted coldly before turning to Trunks and Goten. Would you two like to come with me? Vio! Goten cheered excitedly, a huge grin plastered onto his face. Can I help pick out the food? Please? I'll be good, honest. A mischievous glint sparkled in Trunks' cerulean eyes as he thought of all the possibilities for pranks and jokes that going shopping with his young mother provided. If nothing else, he might be able to get her to buy some supplies necessary for good jokes to play. Yes, we'd love to go with you, Bulma, and we can get ice cream, right? Huh? Pretty please? Ooh, and rice balls and watermelon and cookies and hot dogs and hamburgers and corn on the cob. The black-haired chibi trailed off, his eyes glazing over and drool dangling from the corner of his mouth at the thought of all that delicious food. Snapping out of his daydream, he turned his best sun-puppy-eyed TM on the older girl. Please, can we go with you? Grinning at her 2 volunteers, having no idea what she was getting herself into, Bulma nodded decisively. All right, you two can be my little helpers, she said self-importantly. The heartbreak from earlier that morning already fading a bit. If you two are done eating, go get dressed so we can get going as soon as I have a chance to eat too. Goten and Trunks grinned at each other, the first with innocent delight and the second with mischievous glee, and darted off to their respective rooms, whooping and hollering with excitement. Watching his 2 friends run off to prepare to go shopping with Bulma, Goku fidgeted enviously in his seat, sipping water from cup to wash down the last mouthful of fish. It sounded like they were going to have lots of fun, and he sort of wished that he could go too. Then what Raditz had said only a few moments ago sank in, and he looked hopefully up at his older brother. Yukion. Once he had Raditz's attention, Goku set down his cup of water. Do I get to train with you? Yes. His brother had said he'd train with him, but Goku wanted to be sure. Still feeling immensely relieved that Bulma had decided not to try to include him in her shopping trip, Reichitz grinned at his little brother and reached a hand out to tug the boy's rainbow-colored nightshirt. Sure, but only if you change into a training gi. I won't spar with anyone who's wearing a nightshirt. He would have added something about how it looked like someone had spilled multiple cans of paint on it to create that particular pattern. But he could tell Goku loved the shirt, so he kept his opinion to himself. Hooray! Goku cheered, leaping into his surprised brother's arms to give him a quick hug before jumping down to the ground. Kuzin, did you hear that? The 7-year-old hopped enthusiastically from one foot to the other as he looked up at his father joyfully. Yushin said, he's going to train me. I'm going to go put on my clothes now so I can get started right away. With another loud yell of delight, the Chibi Saiyan zipped out of the room under the amused gazes of his father and brother. "Since when did you decide to train your little brother, Raditz?" Bardock asked curiously as he sat down with his plate of charred fish, grimacing with distaste. He stuffed a mouthful between his teeth and quickly chewed and swallowed. "I am definitely never going to allow myself to think while cooking again." Shuddering, he took a swallow of water and forced himself to continue eating the burnt food. An embarrassed flush tinged Raditz's cheeks, and he stared down at his now empty plate. "Well, it just seemed like a good idea. Goku's so weak, and he hasn't really been trained well. If you wanted to be the one to train him, I really don't mind," he added hastily, glancing up nervously to observe Bardock's reaction. Bardock's eyes danced with amusement as he took another swallow of water, then shook his head. No, you're probably the best one to train him right now, since you're closer to him in power than I am." Up until this point, Vegeta had maintained an uncomfortable silence. He had vaguely wanted to go with Trunks and Goten, but the idea of shopping indefinitely with the annoying blue-haired female made him dismiss that idea swiftly. However, talk of training brought up in his mind another possibility for a way to pass the time, until Trunks and Goten got back. "Bardock," he cut in abruptly, his voice blank and emotionless. "I want to spar with you." He managed to keep all trace of his feelings out of his voice, even the regally commanding note that usually accompanied such statements. There was no pleading, no demanding, a simple statement of fact, and it caught Bardock completely by surprise. "Nana?" he gaped. Surely, that wasn't Vegeta speaking, was it? Vegeta Uji would simply order me to spar with him, since I'm only a third-class soldier, and that didn't sound like an order. "Does this have anything to do with those odd looks he was giving Goku?" I said. "I want to spar with you," Vegeta snapped irritably, scowling off to one side instead of meeting Bardock's eyes. "The other two brats are going with the Chibiana, so you're the only one who—" It was difficult to say, even though he knew that when he got older, it probably wouldn't be true anymore. "Who's stronger than me?" he finally forced himself to say, wincing at the sting to his pride that admitting weakness to a third class caused. His tail twitched wildly with suppressed emotion, until he managed to regain control of himself. Taking a deep breath, he lifted his head so he could stare defiantly into the other Saiyan's eyes. "I need a worthy sparring partner, and you're all there is," he said loftily, sounding more like his old self than he had earlier, despite the fact that he had just referred to a low-class commoner as a worthy sparring partner. Still taken aback by the 10-year-old's reaction, Bardock nodded wordlessly. Reddit stared with slack-jawed amazement before he caught what he was doing, and closed his mouth with an audible click. Bulma, being unfamiliar with Saiyajin society and mannerisms, didn't understand what was going on, but noticed the fact that the bratty little prince seemed to be behaving oddly, though she didn't know exactly what it was that told her this. Shrugging it off as a Saiyan thing, she went back to eating her small portion of fish. Dressed in his traditional orange gi, although it didn't have the symbols of the turtle school on it, Goku waved cheerfully as Bulma took off in her capsule car, followed closely by Trunks and Goten, who had wisely opted to fly under their own power. They both knew exactly what kind of driver Bulma was. Driving with the blue-haired girl was an experience to give even a Saiyan gray hairs, and was something they actively tried to avoid. Once the car and the two Demi Saiyans were out of sight, Goku eagerly turned to his older brother, who was patiently standing beside to him. "I'm ready to start training, Nichan." The little Saiyan's tail waved behind him happily as he shifted into the best fighting stance he knew, waiting for his brother to do the same. "All right, little brother," Raditz smirked, positioning his feet to indicate he was ready to begin. "Let's see what you've got." Knowing better than to hold back, Goku sprinted towards his older brother, fists cocked for the first punch. At the last moment, he pulled up short and swung his knee up towards Raditz's gut, pushing off with his other foot to give the blow a little extra momentum. Raditz smirked and blocked the attack with his own knee, then jabbed a blade-like hand toward the younger boy's head, an attack that Goku narrowly dodged by planting his feet against the teen's chest and launching himself backwards. Flipping gracefully through the air, he landed on his feet with a light teeb about 5 yards from where his brother had been standing. Not allowing the child any chance to recover, Raditz was already zipping through the air at full speed, his elbow leading the attack. Goku's eyes widened at the speed the older Saiyan was approaching at, and he quickly scampered out of the way before Raditz's elbow could bury itself in his stomach. Unfortunately for him, that was exactly what the wild-named teenager was expecting him to do. With a wordless cry of triumph, The 15-year-old whipped his leg around directly into Goku's path, catching the boy across the chest with his shin, his body doubling over Raditz's leg from sheer momentum. The 7-year-old gasped for breath and stumbled backwards, nearly falling down before he managed to regain his balance. Even though he was still a little dazed, Goku used his close proximity with his opponent to his advantage, thrusting a small fist into the older boy's gut with as much power as he could muster, quickly following it up with an uppercut to the jaw. Raditz inhaled sharply, more with surprise than pain, as Goku's fist knocked the air from his lungs, hastily jerking his head back to lessen the damage that the second fist caused as it connected with his chin. Bringing a hand up to bat Goku's arm back down, the older Saiyan whipped his tail from around his waist. Like a flash of brown lightning, the furry tail lashed through the air and curled around his little brother, pinning the boy's arms to his side and holding him helplessly in the air in front of Raditz. Try as he might, Goku couldn't break free of the iron-like grip of his brother's tail, unable even to kick at it because it was out of the reach of his short legs. Trapped in the coils of his brother's tail, Goku continued to desperately strain to free himself, coming slowly to the sinking realization that he just couldn't win this fight. A part of him buried deep within told him to stop fighting and surrender, but it just wasn't in his nature to give up without giving it everything he had. On the other hand, he really wanted to learn what his brother had to teach him, and Raditz wouldn't do that until the spar was over. After another moment of consideration, he sighed and went limp. He was no match, and he knew it, but even in such an uneven training spar, it was no easy thing to give up the fight. Calmly waiting until his brother stopped thrashing, Raditz ruffled the chibi's hair and smiled proudly. "You've gotten stronger, Goku. I still won, but that doesn't change the fact that you did well, especially with that last attack. You were able to think fast and use your size and proximity to me to your advantage, and those blows carried quite a bit of power." Goku's face took on a glow of pride at the praise he was receiving, which elicited a chuckle from the older of the two. "However, you forgot about my tail and my arms. If I'd wanted to, I could have pinned you in a bear hug instead of using my tail, but I wanted to make a point. You have to keep your eyes on all of your enemy, not just the parts of him you're expecting an attack from. And speaking of tails," setting his little brother on the ground, Raditz curled his tail around his waist as he reached out and gently took hold of the younger Saiyan's tail, manually wrapping it around the boy's waist. "You leave your tail open to attack by letting it wave around freely like that. Keeping it in this position will help guard it against being grabbed or otherwise injured." Goku eyed his tail in its new position for a moment, then took a few uncertain steps around the clearing they'd been sparring in, wobbling from the unfamiliar change in balance that this created. "I don't like it," he complained, looking back at Raditz. "It feels funny, like I'm about to fall down, and my tail doesn't want to stay there." "You'll get used to it," Raditz chuckled. "It'll take a few days of practice, maybe a week or two, before your tail will stay there on its own. But it'll eventually become second nature. Now, I want you to walk around in a circle until you can keep your balance." "Do I have to wear it wrapped all the time?" Goku asked, sounding unenthusiastic at the prospect, lurching and stumbling as he attempted to get used to his tail's guarded position around his waist. At one point, he stepped on a loose rock and, arms flailing, fell to the ground with an oomph as his face buried itself into a pile of decaying leaves. Undaunted, he picked himself back up and began his circular journey again. "It'd be a good idea, at least until you're used to curling it in battle, but I won't make you. Most Saiyan children prefer to leave their tails loose when they aren't sparring or fighting. It isn't until they get older and are more prone to be attacked by surprise that they start wearing their tails wrapped around their waists most of the time." It was a simple precaution that most Saiyans took due to the fact that life on Vegeta-sei was a lot more dangerous and unpredictable. One never knew when an enemy was preparing to attack from behind to grab your tail and render you helpless, so as the children got older and healthy paranoia set in, it was only natural for them to guard their tails no matter where they were. Shikyu-sei, however, if Goku remained on this soft, peaceful world, Raditz could easily envision his little brother allowing his tail to hang free clear into adulthood and beyond. Until he had children, that is. Raditz smirked. Babies had a tendency to grab at anything and everything, especially if it moved, and parents quickly learned to guard their tails very closely when small children were about. "All right, little brother, you can stop practicing for now," he called out after several minutes of watching Goku totter around the clearing. "Come here, and I'll teach you some basic ki attacks." "Hi, Honor-chan!" Goku's face lit up at the prospect, and he unwrapped his tail so he could race over to Raditz's side without falling flat on his face. Sitting cross-legged in front of his older brother with his tail flicking happily from side to side, he watched and listened eagerly as the teenager began to describe and demonstrate various energy-based techniques. It wasn't long before he was trying to copy the things his brother was showing him, though as often as not this ended up accidentally singeing either him, the grass around him, or Raditz. Meanwhile, in a clearing not too far from the one where Goku and Raditz were sitting, Bardock and Vegeta faced off against each other, warily eyeing the other's defenses in search of some hole or weakness that would allow them to gain the upper hand. Both Saiyans were breathing heavily and appeared rather bruised and battered, since they had been sparring intensely the entire time that Goku and Raditz had been training. "You're pretty good," Vegeta admitted grudgingly, wiping the sweat out of his eyes, then smirked and added, "For a third-class weakling." Bardock smirked back, refusing to allow the barb to get under his skin. He knew that the young prince was only trying to get him to let his guard down. "So, are you?" he shot back flippantly. For a chibi, his smile broadened as he observed the reaction this taunt elicited, the scowl deepening on the 10-year-old's face and his lips peeling back from his teeth a fraction of an inch. "I'll show you, chibi." Holding out one hand, palm flat and facing his opponent, Vegeta began to concentrate his kie in the center of his hand. Galagun, the world around him turned a bright white, disabling his vision temporarily, as the deadly ki blasted across the space that lay between the two. From the startled yelp and muttered curses, Vegeta knew that his attack had hit home, and he smirked triumphantly. "What's wrong? Too hot for you?" Kami, it felt good to be able to take out his pent-up frustrations on someone else, to be able to fight and go all out. For the first time in weeks, maybe even months, he was truly testing his limits and finding them inadequate. It didn't even matter to him that his opponent was a third-class commoner, only that the man was providing a good challenge, a way to stretch his limits and become stronger. When he was fighting was the only time he truly felt at peace with himself and everything around him. In a fight such as this, everyone became equal as rank was tossed lazily out an open window. Everything was so simple, just you and your enemy and the thrill of the challenge that lay in finding a way to defeat him. With an unmatched glee glistening in his eyes, the young prince launched himself at the older Saiyan and began exchanging a flurry of blows too fast for most people to see. "Of course not!" Bardock laughed irreverently as he blocked an elbow aimed at his ribs. "I'm just getting warmed up," tossing a few balls of energy at Vegeta. The scarred warrior phased out of sight, only to reappear behind the young prince, slamming his doubled-up fists into the small of the boy's back. Vegeta plummeted like a rock for a moment before he regained his senses and halted his downward movement. Even as the 10-year-old looked up in search of his foe, Bardock was already in his prince's face and ramming a fist into the child's stomach. Eyes widening in pain, Vegeta coughed up a few speckles of blood, unable to avoid the elbow that the older warrior slammed between his shoulder blades. The force behind the blow was enough to send the young prince speeding towards the ground, making an impact crater the size of the capsule house where he landed. Groaning in agony, the battered child forced himself to his hands and knees, only to collapse again as a wave of dizziness rippled through his body. The faint sounds of someone landing at the edge of the crater told him where Bardock was, but even with this revelation, he could only barely muster the energy to lift his head enough to watch the warrior approach. He half expected the older Saiyan to gloat over his victory, over the Saiyajin no Oji, to ridicule him for being so weak. In truth, Vegeta wouldn't have blamed him for it, since that was exactly what he was thinking about himself. Even so, he was determined not to let his humiliation show, clenching his teeth while staring up at Bardock defiantly, chest heaving as he gasped for breath, but remained otherwise silent. "Enough," Bardock stated simply once he reached the boy's side. His voice held no malice, no smugness over his victory, no taunting overtones. It was simply enough. Vegeta blinked up at the older man and was surprised to find that Bardock was extending a hand to the fallen prince. The boy didn't know what to do. For several long moments, he stared blankly at the offered hand, then shifted his gaze to examine the warrior's face, searching for some trace of intent in the other's expressionless black eyes. If he had detected even the slightest hint of mockery, or pity, or even sympathy, he probably would have ki-blasted the other Saiyan with every last ounce of energy he had. As it was, he could find nothing. Bardock was simply offering a helping hand if Vegeta chose to take it, no strings attached. After another few moments of scrutiny, Vegeta uncertainly placed his small hand in Bardock's calloused one, allowing himself to be pulled to his feet. After about 5 minutes in the grocery store, Bulma stalked back out, dragging the two little demi-Saiyans by their ears, looking about as ticked off as they come and ready to blow up any second. Popping open the capsule car, she picked up first Goten, then Trunks, and set them in the back seat of the car. Now stay here, and don't you dare fly off anywhere, with or without the car. Honestly, I should have brought Bardock with me. At least he has enough sense not to grab the can from the bottom of the display, or grab 20 of anything that catches his eye, or accidentally knock over the fruit stands, or... Bulma continued her rant for another 5 minutes before she finally cooled off and scowled down at the teary-eyed chibis before her. "We're sorry, Bulma," Goten sniffled, wiping the tears from his eyes. "We didn't mean to." "We just wanted to help," Trunks added glumly, staring down at his feet. Bulma's anger melted away like ice in the sun, and she smiled faintly. She just couldn't stay mad at those two, for some reason. "Yeah, I understand, I guess, but I think it would probably help me more if you two would just stay put in the car while I get the shopping done. I've seen you guys eat, and I've known Goku for some time now, so I can probably guess how much of everything I need to buy." "Here," she said, handing a capsule to Trunks. "This is to make up for having to wait for me. I was going to save it for a treat, but I can always buy more, and you two need something to keep you occupied until I'm done." Giving the two one last beautiful smile, the 11-year-old girl waved to them. "Now, you two be good. I'll be back before you know it." Watching the human girl disappear into the crowd, Trunks sighed and shifted his attention to the capsule in his hand. "What do you think she gave us, Goten?" "I don't know. Trunks, open it up so we can find out." The 8-year-old chibi had already forgotten his shame at being the cause of such trouble for Bulma and was now fidgeting with excitement. He was literally itching with curiosity to know what was inside the capsule. "Okay, here goes." Brushing a hand through his lavender hair, Trunks bit his lip and depressed the button on the capsule, then tossed it to the ground. When the smoke cleared, both boys could only gape in astonishment and dawning glee at what lay before them. 20 plastic buckets of ice cream, each a gallon in volume, sat stacked on the sidewalk, the words Fudge Ripple neatly labeled on their sides. All concerns about the earlier mishaps flew out of their minds as they literally attacked the frozen desserts, tearing the lids off and gorging themselves on the icy contents therein. The sugar instantly entered their bloodstream, going straight to their heads, and it wasn't long before both demi-Saiyans were giggling insanely, bouncing up and down as they continued on to the next bucket of ice cream.